Good afternoon. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the February meeting of the University of Wisconsin System Board of Regents. We're starting 4 minutes late because we couldn't locate the gavel, but we have now found it and we are underway.
Did you hide that?
With that, Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Regent Peterson.
Here.
Regent Greeby. Here. Regent Atwell.
Here.
Regent Bechtel. Regent Delgado.
Here.
Regent Hall.
Here.
Regent Jones.
Here.
Regent Klein.
Here.
Regent Lovezo.
Here.
Regent Manydeeds.
Here.
Regent Mueller.
Here.
Regent Peterson.
Here.
Regent Plant.
Here.
Regent Stanford Taylor.
Here.
Regent Tiedemann.
Here.
Regent Walsh.
Here.
Regent Woodmansee.
Here.
Regent Bechtel.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Before we consider items on today's agenda, are there board members who wish to declare any conflicts of interest with today's open session agenda? Seeing none, let's proceed. Let me begin by offering the full board's thanks to Chancellor Blank and her team for preparing the meeting and welcoming us to UW-Madison. This campus is a world-renowned and it's changing lives, and we look forward to hearing more from the Chancellor and her staff over the course of the next 2 days. In fact, we're going to get started immediately with our meeting by doing just that, and without further ado, I'd like to invite forward our host, Chancellor Rebecca Blank, to share how UW-Madison is navigating the rapidly changing world of higher education. Chancellor Blank.
Thank you very much, Regent President Peterson, and thanks to all of you for giving me a chance to speak this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to come into this crowd. I have been asked ahead of my prepared remarks to address an issue that is widely in the news today, how our campus is responding to the challenge presented by coronavirus. I know it's an issue across the entire system, and President Cross is going to say a few words about this in his report tomorrow. As you no doubt heard yesterday, there is a single confirmed case of coronavirus in Dane County involving a person who recently traveled to China. The affected person has not been on the UW campus recently, other than to report to the UW hospital, and the risk to the general public remains low. More broadly, we have a team established to respond to these events led by our Chief Health Officer, and that team is working closely with all of the state, county, and city public health authorities to make sure that we are tracking what's happening and how and responding as quickly as we can. So that's my opening comment. Let me turn to my prepared comments, and since we're at a university, we'll start with a pop quiz. This is your question. Which industry is facing rapid changes in funding, rapid changes in demand for its product, rapid changes in delivery method, and substantial declines in public support? It's a set question, right? If you said higher education, of course, you would be correct. And I want to depart a little from the usual presentation, which talks about sort of what's happening on our campus primarily, and instead focus on 3 major trends that are affecting higher education in Wisconsin and in a number of cases around the whole country. Ask what those mean for UW-Madison and tell you something about how we're responding. While nimbleness is not typically an attribute that is associated with large public institutions, being nimble, adapting to change is increasingly critical for any of us who want to run successful and top-ranked educational institutions. So let me start. I'm going to talk about 3 major trends: a changing revenue picture, increasing competition from peer institutions, and changing public views of higher education. So let me turn to trend 1, a changing revenue picture. It is not a surprise to anyone in this room that across the country, state support for higher education, particularly in some states, has been in trouble. This is a graph over the last 20 years. This is a long-term trend of how have states changed their spending on higher education. Even with the Great Recession in the middle of this time period, Most states actually saw an increase, but particularly in the Midwest, there are exceptions to that. And Wisconsin over the last 20 years had particularly high cuts to higher education. In the past 20 years, our spending adjusted for inflation, which is all of this, declined by 28%, and only 3 states had larger declines than Wisconsin. And I want to underscore that. The state has had higher levels of disinvestment in higher education over the past 2 decades than almost any other state in the country. That's a long-term trend. It's not related to any particular political party or legislature. And it has created serious problems for the quality and the sustainability of our institutions who had historically been used to higher levels of support. Now let me turn to the more recent time period, the last 5 years. The last 5 years have been times of steady economic expansion and really substantial income growth in a lot of states. And as you see here, most of the states have been reinvesting in higher education following the Great Recession. Wisconsin is among 17 states in which state support has continued to decline, and only 5 states had greater declines in Wisconsin over the last 5 years than any other. We've now had 2 state budgets, the last 2 budgets, with relatively small dollar increases in support for higher ed, which I deeply appreciate. But as all of you know, Wisconsin's spending increases in the state budget have been below the rate of inflation, so we've continued to fall. As a result, our share of revenues from the state has declined. You've seen this graph from a variety of different schools over time. An alternative calculation to looking at this graph is to look at spending per student. In 2018, compared to 10 years earlier, the state spent $1,800 less per student than it did in 2008. At UW-Madison, the decline in state dollars per student has been almost double that. We receive $3,200 less per student now than we did in 2008. So we've had 20 years of being near the bottom in state funding in terms of changes in state funding and higher education, and that has an effect. Now, let me be clear. We used to be a state with higher investments in higher education, and if you look at things like dollars per student, what we're now looking at is we're about an average state, when we used to be a better than average state. What particularly concerns me is 20 years of a trend. If it continues for another 20 years, will put us as a very much below average state. And what I can absolutely promise you is below average states in spending do not have high quality higher education systems and institutions. And this trend obviously is facing all of the big publics, but it's been particularly acute here in Wisconsin. Now, the decline in state funding is happening at all public institutions over time, in many of them at least. But we've had another thing that's been quite unique to Wisconsin, and that's the undergraduate tuition freeze. While other states have had tuition freezes, there is not another state that has had an 8-year tuition freeze of all undergraduate tuition and fees. Of course, declining state support combined with this 8-year tuition freeze gives you a double whammy for the UW system schools. So the University of Wisconsin needs to be affordable, and I'm going to come back and talk about that later. But we do not preserve our reputation, and we don't maintain our quality by making ourselves one of the cheapest schools among our peers and in the region. UW's Midwest peers, UW-Madison's Midwest peers, the other flagship universities around us, have raised state tuition in the last 5 years, as you can see, some more than others. But for instance, let me give you a sense of how our tuition and fees compare. Minnesota, our closest neighbor, charges now $4,500 more in tuition than we do. Michigan charges $4,800 more. Illinois charges $5,500 more. It is important that our UW universities are affordable for low and moderate income families. But that just means we need a robust financial aid program that assures affordability. It doesn't mean we need to price ourselves $4,000 and $5,000 below every one of our near-term peers. And these schools are the schools around us to whom we are most likely to lose students among the big publics. So these are our peers in terms of who we're competing with for students. In addition to declining state support and what's happening with tuition freezes, of course, the other trend that's affecting all of the upper Midwest and the Northeast are the changes in the numbers of high school graduates. And The black line here shows what's happening at the national level. The red line shows Wisconsin, and the black line's on the left-hand scale, the red line's on the right-hand scale. 10 years ago, Wisconsin had almost 70,000 high school graduates in a year. This year, we're going to have about 64,000 high school graduates, and by 2030, that number will shrink to 61,000. That obviously also has implications, and then you end up with a triple whammy, right? Of you've got declining state support, you've got frozen tuition, and you've got declines in admissions. And my other chancellors can talk about this even more coherently than I can, because I have had some other levers that I can pull. Many of them are almost entirely reliant upon admissions and tuition, and that comes from that, and the state dollars. I want to thank you again for the enrollment strategy that I think you passed at the last meeting. You've probably heard more from enrollment strategy at UW-Madison from me than you want to hear. But you have basically made it possible for us to work inside these demographic trends. And just to remind you what you did in December, our commitment is to maintain the number of in-state students at UW-Madison, counting all in-state students who come to us, at 5,200. And where possible, expand enrollments based on our growing number of out-of-state applicants. And I want to note one clear implication of the enrollment expansion that we have seen. I have occasionally been told that we shouldn't be growing faculty and staff, that we should be shrinking, that we should be reducing our funding. And let me be clear, demand for our product has risen substantially. If you look at all applications, they have risen by about 50%. If you look at out-of-state applications, they have doubled, risen by 100%. No private sector company in the world would respond to those increases in demand by reducing staff, cutting programs, and lowering the quality of their services. As a result of the growth in demand and the increase in students in our entering classes that we are taking, that means we need more faculty, more advisors, more classrooms, more student life staff. That's not bloat, and that's not administrative inefficiency. Those staff and those facilities are needed to serve our larger class size. That is a case I'm going to be making repeatedly in various public settings. We are growing, and therefore our facilities and our staff have to grow with that if we're going to maintain our quality. So in the midst of these revenue challenges, what are we doing? You've seen versions of this graph, I think, at least for the last 5 years. And let me start by emphasizing that we need the state. If we're going to offer a world quality education at in-state tuition levels for a substantial share of our students, particularly when our in-state tuition is much lower than that in other nearby states, we need state support at UW-Madison. And I will work with the system and with all of you to do everything I can to continue to argue for reasonable levels of state funding. But as you've heard me say before, we've had to become much more entrepreneurial on campus, looking for ways to increase revenue and to garner resources for the investments that we need. We can neither maintain nor grow our excellence without dollars that allow us to maintain a top-ranked faculty, strong educational programming, and the facilities that students and faculty require to do good work. So you've heard me talk about some of these different strategies in other meetings: expanding summer session, expanding our professional master's programs, running a major alumni fundraising campaign, I'll say more about that in a minute, taking advantage of our applications growth, and making sure our out-of-state tuition is set at the appropriate market level. I want to talk about one of these in particular, which is our Always Forward alumni fundraising campaign. In October, with 1 year to go in the campaign, we met our $3.2 billion goal, which was just great news, and everyone was delighted to hear that on campus and amongst our alums. We are continuing to go. We're not closing the campaign off. We're going to try for a little bit higher, focusing particularly on areas of highest need, which is student scholarships and faculty support. We're going to close the campaign off at the end of 2020, and you're all going to get invited to our celebration of the campaign close next fall. Among the real victories in this campaign, we have funded more than 3,800 new scholarships, over 350 new funded and named faculty chairs or professorships, which really helps us attract and retain top faculty, and substantial private funding that reduces the state dollars needed in some of our building projects. A record 220,000 individual donors have participated in this campaign. And there's particularly good news here at the end of the campaign. In December, for the last year of the campaign, our foundation announced a new $70 million matching fund grant made possible by John and Tasha Margridge. We ran a mortgage match early in the campaign, and we're going to be able to close the campaign off with a second mortgage match, similar to the original one launched in 2014. It is a one-to-one match designed to help us create newly named professorships and chairs for our faculty. Those named faculty positions are one of our best tools for making sure we retain the quality of faculty we want. So that's really good news, and I'm absolutely delighted and want to thank John and Tasha. And I've thanked them already in person, but I'll thank them publicly as well. While these strategies, all of them, have helped us to deal with the changing revenue picture facing all public universities, and I should say the funding model for public universities has essentially fallen apart in the last 20 years. We're not alone in sort of trying to figure out how do you deal with funding for public institutions when you have substantially reduced state dollars, but still have a very strong in-state tuition policy, which is how you serve the state. So many of the strategies we've been pursuing have some limits. You can only expand so many professional master's programs. You can only grow so fast before you hit limits with your dorms and with your classrooms. We're close to that. You can only raise out-of-state tuition so much. We're close to the limits on that. So we're really trying to think creatively about what are the fundraising strategies, the ways in which we can be entrepreneurial to generate investment dollars over the next 5 to 10 years. We have convened a committee with campus and community members to look at some of these alternatives and for bringing new dollars in. And that includes looking at options that a number of our peer schools have implemented, like public-private developments and ways to take some of your assets and monetize them. While when we've developed those ideas more fully, we will be coming back to all of you on the Board of Regents to talk about them, and I expect that's going to lead to a very robust and lively discussion. Let me talk about trend number 2. Increasing competition among our peer institutions. And you don't see this anywhere more clearly than when you look at what's happened to faculty salaries and the amount of dollars you have to put on the table in research dollars and lab dollars in order to attract top faculty. You see this on the international front. This is a slide of the last 10 years. The green is international universities, the blue is US universities, and this is the Shanghai ranking of the top schools in the world. We're around number 25 on that ranking. 10 years ago, the US had the majority of the top 100 universities as ranked by Shanghai. We're now in a minority 10 years later, and that trend is going to continue. So more and more international universities are competing for students and competing for top faculty. Within the United States, you can see similar really strong competition coming at us, and this is a graph of the operating and state revenue available to a number of our peer institutions, big public institutions that we consider our peers. What it shows you is this is the period for which we have comparable data. So it's over a 13-year period, and shows you what the average revenue growth was in all of those universities. As you can see, our peers have experienced an average revenue growth of 4.2% a year. We've grown at 3% a year. Anyone who has run a business can tell you that if you are losing out when your competitors have consistently higher revenue growth, they're investing more in their programs, their staff and faculty, and their quality. It's why I keep talking about the need to create more revenue opportunities and more investment dollars. We are behind. Now, I know that many people look at us and compare us to other schools in the system and say, Becky, you're doing really well. And that may be true, but I cannot emphasize strongly enough, the right comparison is with our peer flagship universities, this set of schools. How do we stack up against our peers? And compared to our peers, we have lost ground, and that's not something we want to see happening here in the state of Wisconsin. Let me look at these data a little bit more closely. It's really a tale of 3 periods. that through the recession, we were actually growing about as fast as everyone else, around 4.2% a year. Even with the recession going on, that was pretty consistent with our peers. We then went into a 2.3% income loss for several years on average. And there is not another school among our peer set that experienced negative income growth over this period, much less for a couple of years. So that put us behind, and we have worked to expand our revenue since then. And while we have caught up, while we're growing again, we're not growing quite at the same rate as our peers, and we haven't caught up. So our peers are on this line, and they're up there, right? And we're down here. And that difference is what we're really seeing when we look at our faculty salaries, when we look at some of the ways in which we've invested in the university. Making sure we sustain revenue growth at the same rate as our peers is really crucial. We have not done that over the last 13 years, as the previous slide shows. So how do we stay competitive? What is it that we need to invest in the midst of this tough competition? There are three things. You're not going to be surprised by any of them. We have to invest in faculty, we have to invest in our educational programs, and we have to invest in high quality and modern facilities. And let me talk about each of these a little bit in turn. Faculty. To attract top faculty, you first actually need to pay them as well as other schools. And UW-Madison, like other schools in the system, has been challenged on this front. We remain near the bottom. We were at the bottom in faculty salaries for almost 14, 15 years. We last year moved, this is among the schools that are considered our peer schools, from number 12 to number 11. But I'm not leading any cheers about we're number 11. It's not where we want to be. We need to be at the median. And while it's good that we're not at the very bottom, we have a lot more work to do. Our full professors on average make 7% less than the faculty at other Big Ten universities. Big Ten universities, some of those are not even our peers. Of course, it isn't money alone. In fact, in many cases, it's not money that's number one in why faculty come to UW-Madison. It's because of their opportunities to have colleagues and do world-changing work here. And there are a number of things we're doing on this front, but the one that I think has probably been the most important in recent years that we've been investing dollars in is our cluster hire program. I know I talked about this a little last year. It's a way to be strategic about hiring in areas of research where a small number of new faculty will really move us from being very good to being excellent and put us on the map. It is cluster hires are basically 3 individuals hired often across different departments who all work on a common area of science where there are a lot of other people around the university who are already working in that area, and this sort of fills in the gaps among our faculty. In the first 18 months since we launched this program, we've approved 15 new research clusters, 3 faculty each. We've hired 16 of those individuals. We have a lot more hiring to do. And we're in the midst, I should say, of another round of cluster hires and approvals this year. Finally, faculty also need to reflect the faces of the community and the world around them. And we have also been focused on making sure that our faculty are diverse. And the Targets of Opportunity program is a short-term program aimed at doing that. It gives schools the ability to come to us and ask for special hiring authority for an individual who they have pre-identified who diversifies them in some way, diversifies them intellectually, diversifies them with regard to gender, with regard to race or ethnicity, with regard to the approach in the discipline. We leave this quite open. Last year, we authorized 42 hires. Now that's an authorization to hire a specific person, not to search. And had 17 accepted offers. We've still got 5 pending. We'll probably end up at about a 50% acceptance rate, which is very good because these are often top scholars who are being competed for by many, many other places around the country. If we can indeed hire 20 new more diverse people into our faculty every year for 5 years, which is what our hope is for this program, that will change the face of our faculty in a number of places. And of course, once you have a more diverse faculty in a department, that changes the conversation with the next hire that they do as well. Well, faculty are important, but of course the educational program is important as well. And those of you in the Education Committee heard the provost talk about this. I'm very proud of our educational statistics. Despite the challenges that we have faced On the revenue front and the financial front, we have worked hard to improve the educational quality of this institution, and by virtually every metric, we have been successful. Our time to degree is now less than 4 years. It's very important for student debt and for getting students out into the workplace. We are ranked number 8 in graduation rates among all public universities. We have very strong career outcomes. Our undergraduate alums increased their earnings by 50% in their first 5 years, and we've just completed a major survey of our alums at 5, 10, and 15 years out that gives us really great information on this. And our latest statistics, 55% of our students graduate with 0 debt. We need to maintain and build on those sorts of educational outcomes, but we also have to be looking ahead to new programs. So let me do 2 slides and some new things we're doing. Online opportunities. This next fall, we're going to launch what is actually our second fully online undergraduate program. We've long had an online nursing degree program. This is going to be a program in personal finance, aimed at students who have some college credit but haven't completed. It's a very hot degree nationally. It has value for a lot of people, not just those in the finance industry. And we have the number 2 ranked program in the country here at UW-Madison. It's going to be housed in the School of Human Ecology and taught with faculty from that school, from Letters and Science, and from the Wisconsin School of Business. It builds on our very strong growing online presence. Many people don't realize that we have more than 12,000 students in online courses already, either in professional master's degree programs or taking summer courses as part of their regular UW-Madison residential experience. We want to grow our online presence in a way that advances our public mission, that serves a wider group of people in the region and in the world, and hope to be expanding our degrees here to reach scale so that we're going to be running 3, 4, 5 undergraduate broadly defined degree programs over the next several years. Second innovation here, I hope you've heard about this one too, our new School of Computer, Data, and Information Science, CDIS, as we call it on campus. This brings together our departments of computer science, of statistics, and the iSchool, which is the old library science school turned into a school of information science. There is huge demand for workers in this area, and there is huge demand among our students. As we open this new school this fall, it has 2,200 undergraduates in majors across those programs. 1,800 of them are in computer science, and there's another 800 students who are graduate students in those departments, so the whole school has 3,000 students in it already, and we expect that to grow. We're launching a data science major through the Department of Statistics this coming year that will be housed in this school. Plus, computer science and statistics, these areas have been growing so rapidly, they've been struggling just to keep up with the increase in demand among majors. But everyone is very aware that this can't just be about serving more and more majors. It also has to be about serving all of the people majoring in other areas who understand they need certain technological, coding, data science, data understanding, and want a certificate or some training in this area as well. So, the educational mission of this school is grow to serve the number of majors and demands, and then figure out how to better serve everyone else on campus who wants to come take some of your courses as well. And as you know, we also launched the American Family Data Science Institute. That's a research institute that runs across campus and brings together all of our faculty with these interests, and their faculty in every single field and college who are increasingly using big data and some of these data science techniques. So you can be creative about your programs and what you're offering, but you also have to be affordable, as I've noted earlier. I'm very proud you've heard of our Buckys Tuition Promise. You met some of the students at lunch today who are in that program. We currently have 1,910 students in Buckys Tuition Promise, or Badger Promise, which is an equivalent program for first-generation students, all with their tuition and fees covered. 1 out of every 5 of our incoming Wisconsin undergraduates qualifies for one of these programs. And this map, the dots keep growing, shows you where all of our Buckys Promise students came from. I believe that's this year's entering freshmen. And as you can see, they're from all over the state, and we keep working on getting the news out, getting more students who can come to UW-Madison to understand they can afford to come to UW-Madison. A side note, I talked earlier about the fact that our tuition and fees are about $5,000 below many of our peers. What we should be doing is moving our in-state tuition somewhat closer to our peers, and then using some of those additional tuition dollars to make sure that students from low-income and middle-income families are held harmless or are paying less than that tuition rate. Bucky's Tuition Promise already guarantees that for all students in the bottom half of Wisconsin's income distribution. That's all students in families that make less than $60,000 a year. I am more than willing to talk about expanding support at some level for our lower middle income and middle income students as well, so they are less affected by any increase in exchange for being able to move our tuition to where the peer tuition sits. We, as I noted earlier, need an affordable university, not a cheap university, where affordability means we are priced with our peers, but then have a strong and robust financial aid program. Finally, last slide on education. Great programs attract great students, and I'm really excited about, I love interacting with our students, right? As you know, we've seen a lot of increases in applications in recent years. That hasn't slowed down. We closed off applications, so I think probably the 2nd or 3rd of February this year, and our preliminary numbers say we're up 4.5%. Now, I should note that that differs between in and out of state. Among our in-state students, that's Wisconsin and Minnesota, we're down almost 3%. That's the biggest decline we've seen. And we're going to work on that. We're going to maintain our commitments to in-state students. Out of state, we're up 7.5%. Those are all early estimates. But the demand for our product continues to grow. And I showed you this slide last year. I could show it to you again, but I'm not going to. We see increasing quality, both in our applications and in our enrollees, both in and out of state. The number of new Wisconsin freshmen whose ACT scores are 31 or higher is up nearly 40% in the last 5 years. Students are also standouts in all sorts of ways. This year alone, we've got a Marshall Scholar, 3 Goldwater Scholars, 3 finalists for the Rhodes Scholarship. You're going to meet one of them tomorrow. So one of the best parts of my job is always hearing from alumni about how they put their education to use and what they experienced on this campus. A few months ago, Jeff Sprecher was on campus to speak to our engineering undergraduates. Jeff is the chair of the New York Stock Exchange and has a degree in chemical engineering at UW-Madison, which he says is the hardest thing he's ever done, is finishing that degree. During his talk, he was asked about what he learned while on campus, and this was his reply. The university is the place where I learned to be an independent thinker, to solve problems, and to recognize the value of being around people who are not just smart, but passionate and enthusiastic and curious about all sorts of things that have nothing to do with their areas of expertise. To work and learn in this environment, he said, was life-changing for him. That is the experience I want for every one of our students. And that is why we're investing and need to continue to invest in people and in programs that will give us that margin of excellence that has set this university apart for generations. Finally, what's the last thing we need to be doing to maintain quality in the midst of peer competition? High-quality, modern facilities. 296 of our 405 buildings are more than 50 years old, and those of you in the Capital Committee saw the presentation this morning. Our deferred maintenance is estimated by an outside firm that does this for all sorts of universities is $1.5 billion, and we are way above our peers on deferred maintenance and below our peers on annual investments in maintenance. This is a disaster at our campus and all of the campuses that are sitting along here. The state used to fund our academic buildings, but in recent years, these facilities have relied increasingly on campus and donor funding. This slide shows about $500 million in current projects. Of that $500 million, the minority is paid by the state, $240, while $245 is gift and grant funded or paid through student fees. For non-academic buildings like dining halls, the state pays nothing while they take out the bonds. These are funded with student fees, operating revenues, or with gifts. But as you know, the state still controls the entire approval and construction process, except in those projects that are 100% gift funded. We need a better and a more flexible process and an ongoing, much better partnership with the state on these issues. We are the only university system in the country without program revenue bonding. That really constrains some of the things we need to be doing. We are responsible for raising money, but we have historically had very limited involvement in the bidding or the construction process. We don't hold the contracts with the contractors. The state oversees that. And those projects, as you know, have faced a number of cost overruns, in part because the incentives just aren't set up right in the current process. That also, I might note, in a world where the state is not our primary stakeholder. Our primary stakeholder are now the people from whom we get grants or the students who pay our fees. We have to be more responsible in the way we're building these projects because we have to answer to those stakeholders, and they won't accept a 10-year project to build a building, right? Some of you, again, in the Capital and Planning Committee have seen this. There's two major facilities that we're going to propose in our budget. The first one, those of you who were here last night saw, it's, we're going to propose to have a new Letters and Science academic building, which is primarily a classroom and office building. We have the largest building on campus, which is this Humanities Hall. As I think Bob Atwell referred to this as the Rusted Pipes tour from yesterday. And indeed, those who took it saw not just rusted pipes, but water coming down, completely inadequate rooms, classrooms, and offices. Over 70,000 credits are taught in these classrooms every year, not just in the humanities, but from faculty across universities, because so many of our classrooms are in this building, given its size. It's in terrible shape. It's crumbling, it is expensive to maintain, and it is close to the end of its life. The cost of rehabbing this building is way beyond what would make any sense at all. At the same time, we have built almost no classroom space outside of professional schools for 50 years. Our last new classroom office building, built for general use in classrooms across campus, was completed in 1972. That's almost 50 years ago. And it is time, particularly with our growing undergraduate body, to build not just additional classrooms, but more modern classrooms, which allow us to do much more interactive and better learning. So we are proposing to build a Letters and Science academic building, providing modern classroom spaces and allowing us to serve the increasing number of students coming to our campus. It would also house several departments, including our top-ranked history program. We can't take this building down because there's too much in it and we don't have any place to move them. There is a 4-phase process that we are working on. Phase 1 has already happened. We built the Music Performance Center you're all going to see tonight that moves part of the music school, its performance aspects, out. Phase 2 is this building, the Letters and Science academic building, which will build a whole bunch of additional classrooms and move some of the departments out. Phase 3, which we hope to come to you in a next budget, has to move the very extensive art department, which is on the top of this building, out. Then we will only have music school left. We will find a place for them, and then this building can come down, and we can start replacing it with other buildings on what is one of our best sites on campus. But it's a long process. This building's still going to be around for another 10 years, and those of you who saw it last night know how bad it is. So we're coming to you for that new LNS academic building, and we're also going to talk to you about a new computer building. This replaces it's 2 small buildings. They are in terrible shape. If we'd taken you through this, it would have looked as bad as the Humanities Hall that we did take you through. It floods regularly. The staff actually, they're engineers, so they know how to do this. They put tubes in the floor so they could drain the water that was coming into the building and interfering with their labs. This is what the wiring in the basement looks like. I'm sure that doesn't meet code. This building is also a 2-phase project about building some additional facilities that allows engineering to expand the number of students who are there and to serve its students who they have better and to teach them in modern facilities. So to summarize, if we are to maintain our reputation in an increasingly competitive higher education environment, we need to be doing all of this around faculty, around education, and around facilities. Let me turn to the third trend, which is changing public views of higher education. Support for higher education has been plummeting in this country, and we can all talk about reasons for that. Let me show you what the trends look like. This is from a National Pew Research Center poll asking people, do colleges have a positive or negative effect on our society in general? As you can see, only 9 years earlier, 61% said a positive effect. By 2019, only 50% said colleges had a positive effect on our university, and 38% said negative. Here's another poll. This is, I think, a Gallup poll from 2019. asking, is college very important? Only half in the United States, and again, this is just a 6-year trend, it changes. 70% said yes in 2013, only 51% said yes by 2019. That's a big shift in opinion in a very short period of time. One of the most concerning aspects of this, in my opinion, is the partisanship here that is growing, that you see very different answers from people of different political parties. One of the things that is supported, particularly the big public institutions like mine, is that higher education has always been a bipartisan issue that has drawn support from across the board, as it has drawn criticism from across the board as well. And increasingly, you're seeing partisan divides in support for higher education that makes us a political football in the midst of a very partisan national political environment. And that is really concerning and problematic for those of us who want to maintain the long support that the state has given to higher education. Here's some data from Wisconsin. We asked people what the perceived value of a college degree was. 40% said it was worth the cost. This is in the state. It's a poll of about 1,000 residents done in November, just a few months ago. 42% said it wasn't worth the cost. That looks pretty bad. But then let's compare it to a national poll that didn't ask about UW-Madison. This is a national poll asking about whether going to one of America's leading research universities was worth the cost. Only 23% said yes to that. 53% said no. These opinions are not well grounded. I don't have to tell you that. Many people hold misperceptions about the cost of college, and they don't understand the financial returns. College-educated persons are the only group that have consistently seen earnings improvements over the last 20 years. And I mean 4-year college recipients, not 2. And college-educated people experience better health, more civic engagement, and indicate they're more satisfied with life in general. But this is the world we live in, where the public is just a lot more skeptical of all sorts of public institutions. It's skeptical of these big public colleges. Some of this may be due to some of the things that have been happening in the overall higher education environment. The so-called varsity blues scandal has prompted a national discussion about privilege, college access, legacy admissions, and the whole admissions process. In a recent poll, 2/3 of the people responded that they agree or strongly agree that college admissions are rigged. I'm happy to say, not at this university. We have the same admissions process for everyone, and our students are admitted on the basis of their own records. We do not do legacy admissions as a separate admissions process, and that is the way we should be at a big public university. Here's what's happening in the state of Wisconsin. On the left, again, your Wisconsin poll. If people who say that admissions process at UW-Madison is fair or somewhat fair, that's 44%. Compare us to the national poll, it's much, much lower, and virtually no one says admissions among Americans' leading universities is fair. I don't think that's a fair analysis of many of my peers, but we are doing much better in Wisconsin than elsewhere, but nobody's doing great on this front. So how do we respond? My reaction is that we have to communicate about this university in this state. I can't change people's opinions about universities out there in the ether, whoever they might be, but I can talk to them about their flagship university in this state and say, look, whatever you might think about debt levels, about admissions processes, about things happening out there in higher education, you should be proud of what we are doing at UW-Madison in this state, in your own university. And that's the message we're trying to get across. We're doing that in a whole variety of different ways. We're doing media messages, we're doing targeted outreach. I try to get around the state regularly, as do some of my deans and some of the other senior people. And we, like the system, are always engaged in outreach to our publicly elected officials. All of our efforts are around the theme, the UW changes lives. And we talk about our life-changing research, our top-notch academic programs, our service to the state, and our commitment to driving economic growth in Wisconsin. Nothing confirms the value of UW-Madison more than a recent Brookings Institution report on the best way to create economic opportunity in this country. The report concludes that the country needs to seed self-sustaining growth centers around the country in medium-sized cities. Brookings developed a list of 35 metropolitan areas that have the right mix of assets to become significant growth centers with some additional seeding and help. Places like Tucson, Salt Lake City, and St. Louis. But the #1 area in the report with the most potential for innovative growth on the list was Madison, Wisconsin. Pushing us to the top was the percent of residents with a college degree and the percent of residents with a doctoral degree in a STEM field. UW-Madison is at the center of those statistics. If you look at this list of metro areas, they all have one thing in common at the top. Every one of them is home to a major research university, most of them a big public university. So higher education is in a time of a lot of change and a lot of ferment. At UW-Madison, we need to be actively thinking about all of these trends and how we're going to respond, and how we're going to respond nimbly and in real time, not over a 10-year period. That means finding innovative ways to fund our public mission, expanding access to a UW-Madison education, investing in our faculty, investing in educational programs that are going to attract top students from around the globe and from this state, and being smart and strategic in how we talk about the value of our institutions. We're not just a center for education and research. We're a powerful engine for economic growth and opportunity. And fortunately, we're building on a very strong foundation. We're located in a great community that is growing rapidly, in a state that has supported us for 172 years. We have a strong interdisciplinary culture that drives discovery and attracts top faculty, and we have a great group of students who do amazing things. And of course, we have traditions that bring us together, from the terrace to various student traditions to Camp Randall and all of our teams. By the way, the Rose Bowl was great fun. I know some of you went there with me. Here's a picture from the Rose Bowl in the upper left. We didn't end with the final score that we wanted, but it's always an honor to be there. We face challenges, as does all of higher education, but we're working to keep our legacy of UW-Madison moving the state of Wisconsin forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Blank, for a very informative presentation. Regents, questions for the Chancellor?
Go get him, Becky.
I need your help.
The always shy Regent Atwell. Chancellor Blank, as you mentioned as it related to in-state students, you talked about the quality increasing while
Yeah.
we're challenged with fewer high school graduates. I wonder if you couldn't comment a bit of what you're seeing by way of, I think you mentioned it was a 7.5% increase in out-of-state students. Yeah. What do their credentials look like first? And I think I know the answer to that, but then I'm also interested in the changes that the ACT will make in 2021. Do you think, what do you think that will do by way of having impact on those stats?
Yeah, you know, I can't predict the ACT changes and exactly what's going to happen. I think no one knows the answer to that. We're all going to watch that very closely. If you look at what's happening to our out-of-state versus in-state students in quality, both of them are, if you measure quality by test scores, and look, that's a very imperfect measure, but it's equivalent, you know, it's an equivalent measure for both areas. You see both rises in average test scores among our out-of-state students as well as our in-state students. We've particularly been working at that in-state because we want more of those students who are looking out-of-state to leave Wisconsin and leave here to go to college to stay in the state, and we want a message to them, UW-Madison is as good as any place else you can go, you know, and for a great price. Don't leave the state. And so, you know, I think one of the reasons we've been successful at raising quality in-state is we're attracting those students, and of course that, by and large, does not draw from the other schools in the state. It's keeping people here who weren't going to go to any of our schools before. Out of state, because we are much more selective out of state than in-state, you know, it's perhaps not, you know, as we've gotten a deeper pool, what's unusual is to be able to expand your numbers, which we've been doing, and expand your quality at the same time. And the reason we can do that is this huge growth in quality of our application pool, both in-state and out-of-state. It's given us just this golden opportunity that very few universities are, you know, have the ability to do, or the moment in time where they can do it. You know, on average, because of greater selectivity out of state, their test scores are a little bit higher than the in-state students, but not by a lot. And I say both of them are going up, which which is great.
Regent Klein.
Yes, thank you, Region President Peterson. Chancellor Blank, it was a fantastic presentation, and I'm just, as an alumni, I'm so pleased with everything you've got going on at University of Wisconsin-Madison. You mentioned in your speech that if you could raise tuition, that you could also increase financial aid.
Yeah.
Are there metrics around that?
Well, it's one of the things we're actually doing some looking at. What type of deal would you offer? We say Bucky's tuition promise is for low-income families, families in the bottom half. What sort of deal could we promise at an affordable level if, say, we said we were going to plow 25 to 1/3 of any additional tuition back into financial aid resources, right? So in exchange for perhaps a slightly larger increase in tuition that gets us a little closer to our peers, what do we do to sort of do hold harmless, not just for low-income students, but for some of those middle-income students from the state of Wisconsin as well? And that's a data question, and I can come back to you with some answers. I don't have all of them right now.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Regent Bechtel.
Yeah, Chancellor Blank, thank you very much for that presentation. Appreciate that you point out the challenges, but really appreciate that you've got some programs and ideas as you're overcoming some of those challenges. This may be a bit of a segue into our next topic, but the Targets of Opportunity program, the top program you described, that sounds very organic and yet also focused. And I'm just wondering if you could give us a little more description of that. You've got that march of 20 new faculty members of diverse thought or background coming in every year, and that's 100 in 5 years. So can you give us a little more description of how that actually works?
Yeah, so we started this last year, and it's particularly targeted at the fact that we are a less diverse institution than many of our peers. And under those circumstances, short-term programs aimed at increasing diversity are allowable, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
And we want to define diversity quite broadly here. It's not just gender diversity, though there are some departments that need that. It's not just racial or ethnic diversity. There are a lot more departments that need that, but also includes intellectual diversity. For certain disciplines, regional diversity may matter. And what we basically did was put an open call out to the departments to say, identify someone who adds diversity to your department and make the argument about why you should be allowed to hire them and what that individual would bring. So we're approving a an individual for the department to make an offer to outside of the normal hiring process. Because the fact that the economics department might need a macroeconomist is fine, but if they really find someone who's a target of opportunity to hire that fills in some gaps for them elsewhere, they might be able to get funding from top. So we're sorting through those arguments. And one of the things I'm really pleased with is I think every school but one put in a top proposal last year. I've talked to a lot of departments about this. They're doing what they should be doing. They're looking out there, they're bringing people in as visitors, inviting them to come give seminars, targeting some younger people and saying, let's watch their career a year or two and see if this is someone we want to try to go after. This isn't just think today about someone you can hire tomorrow. It's think forward about who you need to be hiring and work to court those individuals and to follow them and to make them hireable when you're able to make that offer.
Yeah, no, I love it.
Yeah.
A lot of our private sector clients call those opportunity hires, and to have that pipeline and program in place is tremendous.
Good.
Regent Mueller.
Thank you. And thank you, Chancellor, for that excellent presentation. The Legislative Fiscal Bureau put out revenue estimates in January that were very favorable. Additional funding that wasn't expected, I think $400 million. Have you thought about, some of that seems ideal to secure one-time funding for perhaps deferred maintenance or those programs or areas that would benefit from one-time funding. Are we thinking about approaching the legislature and the governor to use some of that money for that purpose?
Ray, do you want to respond to that? It's obviously a system-wide question.
Yes, we have talked at length about that, trying to identify those kinds of things that one-time money would be very helpful with. We've also had conversations with several legislators, so we're giving it some thought. We have not decided upon anything, although at this point it doesn't look very promising given the comments that we've gotten from several legislators.
Yeah, I would note that I think if you ask all of us, what do we most need, it's base funding. One-time funding doesn't give you long-term program support or faculty salaries or any of that. So one-time funding is always helpful, and I could reel off a number of things we could do with some additional funding. But if this is indeed a long-term increase in the state budget revenues, I'd much rather think about base funding and probably make the argument in the next budget round.
I think that's been one of our challenges. In August, we will put before the board a very comprehensive budget proposal. And we are fearful that this would interfere with that kind of request.
If I may, I just put in a plug for the deferred maintenance, because it's painful to see those pictures year after year, and I've seen them for 6+ years now. And it's not just a problem at Madison, of course, it's all of our campuses. And that truly is one time.
Just a comment on that, I certainly think that the reinvestment that we saw in the capital budget this last biennium will go towards much of that. And I think to this question of one-time dollars, internally, we as a board need to be thinking about that, right? The message that we send to the legislature as it relates to our operating budget this next time around, we certainly would like to see that reinvestment take place. And I think you want that predictability, as the chancellor highlights, for that to take place in the out years, right, as well. So as much as anything, this is a great opportunity. It's also a timing component that we need to think through as a board. Regent Delgado.
Chancellor, thank you. I want to particularly support and stress among the things you have said, which you have said many things that are worth supporting, is your, what I would call your marketing program, trying to improve the knowledge of our people in Wisconsin have of the value of education and of the value of our university. Of all the worst scenarios that I can think of, performing well and looking bad is the worst of them all.
It can be frustrating.
It is our story to be told. It also is a great threat to the society when, first of all, we do not appreciate higher education. Second, we do not appreciate what we have in the state. And frankly, it is our fault. Let's take it on. If we have not being able to explain ourselves to the public, it is our fault. It is a responsibility to do it, and I support strongly what you're doing, because it is an essential element of everything else you're trying to do. Public support, in as much as the people who want to come here, and also that they want to value what we do, is extremely important to us. And I'm afraid that we have for a long time bemoaned the fact that our reputation has gone down without doing much. So what I've seen of the marketing efforts from this university has made me extremely happy, and I want to encourage that.
Yeah, thank you. And the fact that these trends are across the nation means that it's not only things that are happening in Wisconsin, right? The fact that we actually, while we don't look the way I want us to look, are much better than people's impressions of school around the country is good news, and I think reflects the fact we're doing some of this. But we've got to keep this up. We've got to move some of those trends up higher so people appreciate what they have in the whole higher education system.
An advantage.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe picking up on Regent Mueller's thoughts, one area where you and our other chancellors have particular passion as it relates to our capital projects.
Yep.
It relates to that PR bonding authority. In the most professionally diplomatic way, could you talk about how it's not always about the money, it's about the process and flexibility? Just give us a sense of how you would approach things differently in a flexible environment.
I will say that compared to my peers in any other university, I have almost no control over my planning for capital projects, which for a $3 billion plus institution which has a larger footprint than any other institution in the state, is a really serious problem. I have to, in order to have a project done on this campus, have to get both houses of the legislature, the governor, the state building commission to sign off, and then the project is largely run out of the State Department of Administration. And those are good and competent people, but they don't have they don't have the students and the faculty and the clients and you know, and so the incentives just aren't set up well here. And it's very, very hard to do a planful job of updating and maintaining our capital in a world where, you know, not only do we not have any control over saying how much money we're going to have next year or the year after that, I mean, none whatsoever, which is completely unheard of in any other university, but we also have almost no control over the projects. Now, you know, given some of the problems we've had in some of these projects, I think we've developed some new opportunities to partner better with DOA, and I'm really pleased about that, and I hope that continues as we move forward with other new complex projects. You know, we have to have some greater authority here, and program revenue bonding, in my opinion, is the right way to start.
Thank you. Other questions from board members? Regent Atwell.
Becky, thank you very much. Outstanding job. Kind of picking up on Regent Delgado's point about marketing. When I look at the disconnect, and I guess my own experience in bringing a product to market, you got to have a great product, right? And your passion and the reality of the numbers, we have something very good. Half the market we depend on to get the impediments to our future progress addressed has a very negative outlook on us. And so changing that, at least in my opinion and experience, is not a matter of just telling people how great we are. We have, first of all, it has to be true if we're going to say it. But I think it really is good. I'm not skeptical about that, or I wouldn't be here. We have to have respect for the people who don't see that, and really enter into their minds. What is it? And be willing to listen, even if it's really hard. What is it about what they think or don't understand? And I believe we have to start inside their world. And even if it's painful, enter into it, understand it, and then you can begin to get into the means of how you change the discussion and change minds. Just my advice from the unshy corner of the table.
And anyone in the banking industry has some similar issues over recent decades, right? Persuading people. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think listening is important, and it's one of the ways we try to use our alumni around the state, because our alumni come with all sorts of views, right? And they can often express those views to us, and, you know, we can pull them together in they'll come together and talk to you about that, and I appreciate the comment. Yeah.
Seeing no further questions from the board, I would just leave on a high note by giving you again accolades. Your capital campaign is astonishing, $3.2 billion, and it's not done.
It's not done yet.
The mortgage announcement, the second tranche, really outstanding. Congratulations for a wonderful.
Thank you, and thanks to all of the alums who've been part of that. Thank you all.
Turning to our next agenda item, the Wisconsin idea is at the very core of who we are and what we do here at the UW system. Meeting the state's needs and finding solutions to its most pressing problems are central to our ongoing mission. A persistent challenge that we must all face is the achievement gap, or the opportunity gap that exists between students that are white and students of color. It is a significant national issue, but it's also one that's especially profound in some parts of Wisconsin. We need to constantly seek to find these answers. As a public university, and to uphold our commitment to the Wisconsin idea, the UW system must serve all students. It's both a moral and an economic imperative. We're fortunate to have with us today several experts who will help articulate the need to address this problem, and who will also present a number of practical, evidence-based solutions for us to consider as a board. We have 3 presentations that offer different perspectives on the achievement gap challenges facing us and others. At this time, I'd like to invite all the presenters forward, which they've accommodated. And here's how these presentations will work. We'll first hear from Mr. Tim Sheehy, President of the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce. Tim also serves on the board of the Milwaukee Development Corporation, an MMAC affiliate, and serves as a director on the State of Wisconsin Investment Board. Over the years, Tim has been appointed by 3 Wisconsin governors to chair various state commissions. In his presentation today, Tim will focus on regional efforts to address the achievement gap and the real-life and long-term implications for Wisconsin's workforce. Next, we will hear from Dr. Timothy Rennick, Senior Vice President for Student Success and a Professor of Religious Studies at Georgia State University. As I understand it, Dr. Rennick is snowed in and will be joining us from Atlanta via Skype. I'm not sure if the doctor has joined us yet, but we anticipate that, and we'll see how well we do with our audio-visual strategies. Dr. Rennick, since 2008, has directed the student success and enrollment efforts of the university, overseeing among the fastest improving graduation rates in the nation and the elimination of all achievement gaps based on students' race, ethnicity, or income level. He's currently principal investigator for a $9 million U.S. Department of Education grant to study the impact of predictive analytics-based advising on 10,000 low-income and first-generation students nationally. In today's discussion, Dr. Rennick will address evidence-based ways to address the achievement gap, including more intentional use of advisors and what resources it takes to make significant progress. Board members, you will recall that the UW system is already working with our institutions and the Educational Assistance Board to implement the Navigate Student Success Management System. This student support system uses the predictive analytics that Dr. Rennick will speak about. Finally, we will hear from Dr. Angela Byers-Winston, a tenured faculty member in the Division of General Internal Medicine within UW-Madison's Department of Medicine. She is also the Director of Research and Evaluation in the UW Center for Wisconsin Women's Health Research. She is Associate Director in the Collaborative Center for Health Equity and faculty lead in the Center for the Improvement of Mentored Experiences in Research. Dr. Byers-Winston is a highly respected scholar on the impact of culture and career development for women and underrepresented racial and ethnic groups in STEM fields, and that's STEM with 2 M's: science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. Today, she will discuss her research on mentorships and the implications for both policy and practice. So following these 3 presentations, Regent Hall will moderate a discussion. We're setting aside time and opportunity for regents, chancellors, and others to ask questions, so get those formulated as we hear these presentations. So with all of that, to get us started, Tim Sheehy, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in front of the Board of Regents, and I appreciated catching Chancellor Blank's presentation. And as someone sitting here who's on the cusp of graduating the 3rd generation of our family from this institution, I have a high regard for the work that you all put in as volunteers and for the role of the university. I've got some tough information to pass on. And I want to start, as I was thinking back here, about some of my studies in economics, and want to approach the issue that you're all very familiar with in terms of the achievement gap from the perspective of opportunity cost. And if your economics are a little rusty, opportunity cost is the cost incurred by not enjoying the benefit associated with the next best alternative. So as we think about the achievement cost of not graduating some of the growing diverse talent in this community and the constrained pipeline that we have, I want us to think about it from 3 perspectives. The opportunity cost or the loss of the moral obligation that we all have to develop our fellow citizens. I want us to think about it through the lens of the loss of the business imperative to gain the best talent that we can. And I want to think about it from the loss of the responsibility we have of stewards of the taxpayers' resources. So I'm going to do this in the context of Metro Milwaukee, which is what I know best. Our membership employs about 300,000 people in the region, have a really good sense of what's going on in the economy and how talent, the K-16 and the university system impacts our growth. So I'm going to start with a very brief description to set up some economic context for this discussion, and I will bite my chamber tongue and not turn this into a commercial for Milwaukee. So as we think about this going forward and we look at the human capital, the talent that we rely on, the citizens that are going to be important to our future growth, and I look at Milwaukee, it's taken quite a while for us to stand on the big stage with the bright lights that are coming in 2020 through the Democratic National Convention and the Ryder Cup. And if you read the New York Times, Forbes, the Wall Street Journal, or Thrill List, you'll see that Milwaukee is on the short list in 2020 of places to visit. So lots of really good things happening in the community. One of the unique assets we hold in the state is the economy that's made up. One of the slices of that economy is the fact that we have the third largest percentage of Fortune 500 headquarters per capita in the country. I'm not going to go through every aspect of our economy, but that's one of the things that makes us unique in the state of Wisconsin. 2019 saw a historic high, 890,000. It's the most number of people employed in Metro Milwaukee in our history. And on the flip side, the unemployment rate of 2.7% was the lowest in Milwaukee's history. As we look forward, in a good way, it's a freaky time for Milwaukee. And we look forward to celebrating that going forward. One of the things that we have to celebrate in the community is our growing diversity. If you look at the population over 65 in Metro Milwaukee, this is not the city, this is the metro area, 18% of our population over 55 is African American or Hispanic. Look at the population of your future students. 44% of that population between the ages of 5 and 9 are African American or Hispanic. On the flip side of this, while we have growing diversity, we have the growing challenge of segregation. This is a map of the city of Milwaukee, residents by race, and you can see the intense concentrations in the city segregated by race. So we have some great opportunities, but we have some big challenges as we look at our achievement gap. This is not a list I would put up selling Milwaukee, but this is an opportunity to be honest about our challenges. 16% of the third graders in the city of Milwaukee are reading at grade level. We have 100,000 of our adult population without a high school degree. If I narrowed that slice to the opportunity youth, 18 to 24 years old, which Regent Hall is very familiar with, we have about 20,000 people between the ages of 18 and 24 that are not in school and do not have a job. Net migration is not moving in our favor. And when I look at job openings, probably the biggest opportunity cost here is we have 35,000 unfilled job openings in the 7-county region of southeastern Wisconsin, and that's projected to grow by 7% by 2021, and then the proverbial bottom drops out as we see retirements far exceeding new people coming into the workforce. So it's in this context I want to talk about the achievement gap. And like any institution, a vision is a destination. So where do we want our region to go? We want to be globally competitive, we want to have high value employment, and we want a vibrant quality of life for all. And we have 3 core strategies that are aimed at getting us to that destination. And the first one, and the one I'm going to focus on today, is talent. Developing, recruiting, attracting, and retaining a diverse group of lifelong learners. At no time in our economic history do skills have a shorter shelf life than they do today. So it's increasingly important that we prepare people to be lifelong learners. We want to continue to grow, and we want to have a livable community to attract and retain the talent that's important. So as we focus now on being a region of choice for all, I want to focus on the imperative of developing, attracting, and retaining the diverse talent of lifelong learners that we're going to need to be successful. This is true of Milwaukee. It could be true of any area in Wisconsin or in the country. Employers are increasingly focused on their connection to talent. It's what's going to drive their growth. And if you think about it, there are 4 buckets that companies can draw talent from. They can upskill their current workforce. They can draw from the K-16 education pipeline. They can draw from people that are on the sidelines of the economy in terms of untapped potential, or they can recruit people who aren't in the market into the market to join their company or to join the region's economy. So I'm going to focus particularly here, because of you all, on the education pipeline. When you look at the high school graduation rates, now this is coming out of the city of Milwaukee. When you look at the high school graduation rates, they're on the rise. They're up to 68% as far as 2018 goes. When we look at post-secondary enrollment, it's declining. And we look at post-secondary completion, it's declining even further. So we're graduating more students, but fewer are enrolling. And of those that are enrolling, fewer are getting through. Statistics can be a little numbing. If you look at the top line here, that 68% represents about 4,200 students in this data set. And that completion rate after 6 years post-high school, that completion rate of a post-secondary institution amounts to about 500. So 4,200 high school graduation, 500 6 years later are completing. If I look at the 2018 line for African American students, we have about 2,600 in the high school graduate pool, and about 240 completing their secondary education 6 years later. For the Latino population, it's about 826 and 70. So these are really challenging numbers. When I look at it through the lens, kind of moving even earlier on, this is a snapshot of math proficiency on the ACT Aspire. So this is before you're taking the ACT course. These are 25 high schools in the city of Milwaukee and 3 high schools in the suburbs. Nicolay, Whitefish Bay, and Homestead, for those of you who aren't familiar, are the suburban high schools, and you can see what their scores are, between 64 and 79% on the ACT Aspire. And you can look at the 25 high schools in the city, 16 of which have less than 5% of their students proficient in math measured by the ACT score. Taking another slice of this, this is the most recent data on the aggregate ACT scores from students in the Milwaukee Public Schools. These are the percentage of students in each of the 4 categories, English, math, reading, and science, that reach the benchmark for the ACT in terms of getting a B or C or higher in a college course in that area. I'm going to apologize for the composite scores on the bottom. There shouldn't be a percentage there. Those should be raw composite scores. I don't remember currently, but I think to get into UW-Madison, you're at about a 27 or 28. UW-Milwaukee, I think, is about 18 or 19. So you can look at the composite scores of these students and their chances or challenges of getting into and through a university like UW-Madison or UW-Milwaukee. So to try to wrap this up in one picture here and use these statistics, here is a class of high school freshmen, a class of 20. Of that class of high school freshmen in the city of Milwaukee, 14 are going to graduate. Of those 14, 5 are going to go on and enroll in the fall in a 2-year or 4-year institution. And within 6 years, 2 of those are going to graduate. So 20 high school freshmen, and the result is we are going to have 2 students 6 years after their high school graduation that are going to come out of a 2-year or 4-year institution. That is a tremendous, daunting opportunity cost, no matter how you look at it in Wisconsin. You see this, and I'm using your data. You're probably more familiar with it than I am. This is 10-year enrollment data for the UW system as a whole for African American students, basically flatline. There's been no increase in the enrollment in the number of African American students. When we look at the Hispanic, Latino, or Latina students, less than a 1% average percentage point gain. And when I look at students of color, and I realize that more students are reflected in 2 or more races, we've had less than a 1% gain in the average change in terms of the number of students. I'm not doing that to point at the university. I'm doing that to point out the challenge we have when we have such tremendous leakage in our talent pipeline and preparation for students that are even getting to a 2-year or 4-year institution. Again, using the system's data, when I look at this, our throughput here is roughly in the 15 to 16% range when I look at African American and Hispanic or Latinx students in terms of their enrollment, and then the graduate across all degrees in the University of Wisconsin system. We hear this loud and clear from our employers. We want a more diverse workforce, we want to grow the diversity of our management talent, and we have a severely constrained pipeline when we're going to draw from the UW system. There's a lot of things to unpack here. I'm going to stick with one thing and kind of pick up on what Chancellor Blank talked about, which is the need to look at things a bit differently. This is a snapshot of almost 30 years in the city of Milwaukee. If this were 1997, almost 100% of the students that were publicly funded went to the Milwaukee public school system. Right or wrong today, we no longer have a school system in the city. We have a system of schools where publicly funded students can go to the Milwaukee public schools, they can go to a public charter school, or they can take public funding and go to a private school. So my point here is that a little over half the kids are in the traditional system that most of us grew up with. The rest of the kids are getting educated in other publicly funded institutions in the city of Milwaukee. And we have to think differently now. If we have a model where informed parents have the resources to choose where they send their kids to schools, we have to start thinking about how we deliver resources to that system. I'm going to think about one that you all touched on, which is faculty recruitment, or in the K-12 system, teacher recruitment. Last year, MPS filled 640 teaching positions, 640. Of those, 28% were black and brown. In less than 3 years, 40% of those teachers, the black and brown teachers, will be out of the system. So we have to think about how we serve a system of schools differently than we've served the school system traditionally, especially when it comes to recruiting and retaining talent. The other piece I'm going to leave you with is, this is a reflection of all of the students that are captured in the state report card, the DPI data. And DPI puts out a report card, and through a number of different metrics, rates schools from highly performing to failing. These are my words. They have different words for it. And so if you look at the chart here, the thing I want to focus in on just for time, from a time point perspective, is there are 15,000 students in independent public charter schools. The University of Wisconsin system has given UWM the authority and the ability to charter schools. I'm hopeful that you continue to support UWM in that authority, because the independent charter schools are not the only way, but they're one way in which we are seeing more achievement and more gains, particularly for diverse students. All of these school systems here, the public school system, the choice program, and the charter program, are serving, by and large, low-income minority students, and we want to make sure that we get more to and through 2- and 4-year institutions. So with the time remaining, I'm going to flip now and turn the lens to employers and what employers are doing in an environment where they have a constrained pipeline, and making sure that we don't look at this constrained pipeline as an excuse to improve the workplace as we reflect on our need to be a region of choice for diverse talent. So again, when we look at the metro area through the lens of diversity and prosperity on a broad basket of measures, and we compare Milwaukee to 20 of our peer markets, we have the largest prosperity gap between white, African American, and Hispanic individuals in our community. This is a tremendous challenge and a huge opportunity cost to the growth in our prosperity. We are on the bottom when it comes to prosperity for African American citizens, for Hispanic citizens, and when you compare those two to the white community, we have the largest gap of any of our peers. So last year, we recruited 35 employers that had 125,000 people employed in the Metro Milwaukee area. And we asked them to take their diverse management talent and participate in a survey. So we had over 1,100 diverse management talent participate in this survey. And I'm going to take you through the findings. We had a series of focus groups. We have a lot of other things going on. But I want to show you some of the raw data from the survey of those 1,100 diverse management talent that participated. 62% of African American managers felt that they had limited exposure to opportunities. 56% of Hispanic Latino managers felt they were overlooked or ignored. Think about your own workplace, and you think about the challenge of these results from people working in your organization. 60% believe that diversity and inclusion are focused on compliance, not culture. 43% of the diverse managers felt discrimination or bias in their workplace. 64% felt discrimination in the community. So what we're saying is, while we have a constrained pipeline and that needs to improve, we also need to improve our places to work, and we need to improve our community if we are going to be a region of choice for all and attract, retain, and develop the graduates that are coming out of this university, other universities in the state, and other places around the country. So we have taken up a challenge, and we have committed to increasing our management and total employment by 25% in terms of our management ranks in companies, and in terms of our employment by 15% between now and 2025. Now you're going to look at the raw data and say, well, this isn't really a big jump. So if you look at total employment, and the goal is to grow that by 15% over the next 5 years, which would take our total workforce from 22% to 25%, and think that that's not a very big jump, that is twice as much growth has happened in the last decade in half the time. So it may not be an aspirational goal, but it's a big move in terms of where we're trying to get to in the Milwaukee area. And when you look at it by diverse management, 25%, which means that 10% of our management in the companies participating would be African American or Hispanic or Latino. And so to back this up, to date we've recruited 87 employers with 140,000 employees that have signed what we call our ROC Pledge. I know Regent Bechtel's company, his firm, is participating in this. And our goal is to get these companies to share best practices, to improve what they're doing, and to collaborate to lift this region as a place to recruit and retain talent. I know this is a small list. Here are the companies that are participating to date. We hope to grow that. We hope to engage these strategies, and we want to put Milwaukee on the map as a place to recruit and retain diverse talent. So I look forward to the question and answer session, to some of the other strategies that we're engaged in, and we look to improve our partnership with the K-16 pipeline, and in particular the UW system, because if we're going to solve this problem, we're going to solve it together on a collaborative basis, and we need to do it if we're going to continue to grow as a region, we're going to continue to prosper, and we're going to continue to put our communities in a place where our citizens are capable of being just that, great citizens. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tim. Tim, for the efforts of you and the association. This is both a sobering but a statistic-rich presentation of the current climate, and you can see the opportunity and not just the opportunity cost. It's terrific. As we're moving on, we will now shift to Dr. Tim Rennick of Georgia State University. As I mentioned before, we're going to attempt technology here and hope that Dr. Rennick can be heard over the audio, and we'll have visibility to his presentation, both on the monitor and behind me. Dr. Rennick, do we have you?
Yes, are we good to go with the slides? Can you hear me?
Dr. Rennick, do we have you?
Yeah, okay, there we go. Okay, they've unmuted me, so I think we're ready to go. And I apologize for not being there. When we planned a visit on February 6th, I did not imagine that the weather problem would be in Atlanta and not in Wisconsin. So thank you for having me today. I'm going to focus on the challenge of closing equity gaps for our college students, and in many ways creating challenges with equity in the workforce before the students even graduate. I'm starting this afternoon with some national data. This is from the New York Times. I intended to underline the challenge in front of us. This shows the percent of Americans who actually hold the bachelor's degree, and the data are disaggregated by economic quartile. So what you're looking at are the last 40 years from 1970 to the present. And what you can see is there have been significant changes in bachelor's attainment over the last 40 years, but entirely in the upper half of the economic spectrum. If you're among the top 25% wealthiest Americans, your prospects of holding a college degree have basically doubled over this time period. 40% of the population held the college degree back in 1970. Now we're up over 80%, which is fantastic. But if you look at the lower bands of this chart, you'll see the numbers are much more sobering. Despite all our national and state efforts, we've moved the needle hardly at all, about 6% to 8% of the population. And what you can see here very graphically is the gap between the wealthiest and least wealthy Americans is not getting narrower. It's basically doubled over the last 40 years. So you take these national data and add this additional set. Over the last 6 years, we've crossed an important threshold in the United States. For the first time since these data have been collected, the majority of K through 12 public school children now qualify as low income. In fact, you can draw a line across the United States, roughly from California to DC, and every state below that line has already crossed the 50% threshold. My state of Georgia is already over 60%, and I can assure you that line is creeping northward. For those of you who can't see, Wisconsin's currently at 41%. So you put these two pieces together, and it should give all of us pause. We as a nation have not figured out how to successfully graduate low-income students, and yet that is the majority population working its way through the K through 12 public school pipeline. It's also a good introduction to my home campus, Georgia State University. We're a big public university, 35,000 students on our Atlanta campus alone. We are not the University of Georgia. We're not Georgia Tech. In fact, if there's any claim to fame that Georgia State has historically, it may be our geography. We have the uncommon distinction of having our campus bisected by a National Park Service historic district. The office I work in every morning is about 4 blocks away from that brick building at the bottom of the screen there, Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Reverend King was head pastor. His gravesite and his birthplace are right adjacent to the Georgia State campus. And yet, for much of our history, we did not live up to that legacy. Georgia State was segregated well into the 1960s. These are shots of what Georgia State looked like when the Reverend King was doing his groundbreaking civil rights work. And then much more recently than the 1960s, Georgia State was still grossly underperforming when it came to students of color and lower income students. We were a poster child for the equity gaps. Overall, our graduation rates hovered around 30%, and year after year, semester after semester, the white students outperformed the students of color, and the middle and upper income students outperformed our low income students. And what makes Georgia State's story hopefully instructive for your purposes in Wisconsin, but also hopefully a little bit inspirational, is what's happened at Georgia State on the surface since these numbers were locked in 15 years ago would not suggest that Georgia State would be the site of a turnaround. For one thing, we were going through significant demographic changes. Over my career here as a faculty member at Georgia State, we've moved from an institution that was majority white, over 70% of our students were white when I arrived, to a minority serving institution as of about a decade ago, to a institution now that is almost 3/4 non-white. There's no majority population. Our largest single group are African American students now, about 39%. The other demographic shift we've gone through over the last 15 years is our students have gotten a lot less well-resourced financially. The recession hit Atlanta really hard, and especially hit the families that send their sons and daughters to Georgia State very hard. And in a 5-year period, starting around 2008, we basically doubled the number of Pell-eligible students we enroll at Georgia State, from about 30%, now you can see, to almost 60%. To put this scale into some perspective, this semester at Georgia State, we enrolled 28,900 Pell students. The entire Ivy League combined is enrolling about 9,800. So Georgia State is trying to educate about 3 times the number of low-income students as the entire Ivy League combined. Not only is this not going to be business as usual, it's also one of the first lessons I'd like to underline for you this afternoon, which is this is not an opportunity to create programs. Educators love when they have a problem to create a program. We'll do a special initiative for African American males or Latino students or low-income students. When you have 28,900 low-income students enrolled every semester, that's not the opportunity for a program. You just need to change the institution at its very core. And that's just what we've worked on doing at Georgia State over the last 10 years. Not creating boutique programs, but changing how we interact with every single one of our undergraduates. You know, it's easy to point fingers when the demographics are turning against you, as it seemed they have at Georgia State over the last decade or 15 years. What we did at the beginning a decade ago is shift the focus. We got better at data, and we used the data to analyze our own practices and our own policies. Surely if 7 out of 10 students are coming to Georgia State and dropping out, some of the responsibility falls on us, falls on the university, the way we support students, the way we advise them, and so forth. So we got much better with the data, and we used the data to identify the key ways in which we were serving our students poorly, and then used the data in order to create interventions that could resolve those problems. So what I have the time to do this afternoon is share with you 3 specific examples of, in first instance, the data that we saw that indicated a problem that we ourselves had created, and then secondly, what we did to try to respond. The first example is a growing national problem, commonly called summer melt. As recently as 2015, 19% of our confirmed freshman class never made it to the first day of classes. Now here I'm not talking about students we admitted to Georgia State who ended up going to another university. That's over 50% of our student population. These are students who have been admitted and then confirmed they're coming to Georgia State. They come to orientation, they sign up for classes, they just never show up once the fall semester begins. So we did a data analysis. Who are these students? What happened to them? And what we found was disturbing. 12 months after they were fully qualified and ready to begin at Georgia State, there were over 250 freshmen who hadn't attended a single day of post-secondary work anywhere across the United States. They had just melted out of the college-going population before they even got their foot in the door. And if you look at the breakdown of these students, they're predominantly low income, predominantly non-white, just the students we need to succeed with as a nation. So we did an audit. Why are these students dropping out? And not surprisingly, we found that we were a big part of the problem. Embarrassingly, we found that there were about 14 different bureaucratic steps that we expect students to complete in order to be ready for the first day of classes at Georgia State. Federal financial aid forms, you're all familiar with those. Verification processes, over 30% of our students are selected by the federal government to provide additional documentation after they submit the FAFSA. And we found that in many cases, that was what was tripping up our students. Or the state immunization requirements. the state of Georgia requires students be immunized for major diseases before they can register for classes. We found in each of these instances, not only did these bureaucratic steps weed out a certain number of our incoming freshman students, but they disproportionately penalized, impacted our low-income and first-generation students. After all, it's not the middle and upper-income students that will have trouble showing immunization records. It's that student being raised by his grandmother that's been bounced around from school to school that might not have the records. So what we did for the summer of 2016 is make some simple technology-enhanced changes to the way we onboard all our students at Georgia State. We created a portal that takes them through the 14 bureaucratic steps they need to complete. Because it's a portal, I can now see where students are in the process. I used to know that students were engaged and then they stopped engaging. Now I know students are engaged up into the point where, for example, we had asked for their immunization records and then we stopped hearing from them. So we can reach out with much more specific help. And I will say the data we've collected from this portal has made significant changes to our practices at Georgia State. This summer, for the first time, at every one of the 40 summer orientations that we hold for our incoming freshman classes, we had a mobile health unit park outside and provide free immunizations to the students. For $50 cost of an immunization, we can turn a number of these students from not enrolling in college to college enrollees. And the second thing we did, and this has gotten more national attention, is we launched an AI-enhanced chatbot. A chatbot is just an automatic texting platform. We built up a knowledge base of answers to commonly asked questions by incoming freshmen. We worked with the tech provider to put it on a smart device so students could text 24/7 any question they have about financial aid, registration, immunizations, and so forth, and get an immediate response. The AI locates the right response in the knowledge base and pulls it out for the students. When we launched this chatbot in June 2016, about 3 or 4 months before the start of our fall semester, we estimated we have 5,000 to 6,000 questions answered by the chatbot before the start of classes. In those 3 or 4 months alone, just for our incoming freshmen, we had over 180,000 questions answered with the average response time 6 seconds. What we found is the usage of the chatbot was heavier at 1 a.m. than 9 a.m., which says something about when students are working through these issues and trying to resolve them. But we also conducted focus groups with the students and found a number of students who admitted that they asked the chatbot questions they wouldn't have asked a human being. If you can't get your biological father to sign the FAFSA because you haven't seen him for the last 2 years, the last thing you want to do is go into some stranger's office and spill out your family's history to them. The students told us they liked the fact that the chatbot was non-judgmental, was a tool put in their hands. And did these simple technological changes make a difference? Made a big difference. In the 3 years since we've had these tools in place and refined them, we've reduced summer melt at Georgia State by 37%. That translates into over 350 students who are in their seats ready to go for the first day of class, who were sitting out college entirely just a few years before. The second example is this one, 1,000. 1,000 was the number of fully registered students who we were dropping from their classes because they couldn't cover the payment of their tuition and fees. This was devastating. These were students who were fully qualified and wanting to stay enrolled and get their college degree, who we were having to remove because of financial holds and other financial problems. And when we looked at the data more closely, we found something very interesting, which is the biggest subset of these students we were dropping for financial reasons were not freshmen, they were seniors. Why seniors? Because we enroll so many low-income students. It was the low-income students who were running out of eligibility for their aid programs. Most scholarships, especially merit-based scholarships, only cover 4 years. If you are a first-generation student and working like over 80% of our students do, and you take one additional semester because your work demanded you to slow down or withdraw from some classes and so forth, then you're going to run out of aid before you graduate. So we literally had students by the hundreds walking away from Georgia State only a semester or two away from completing their degree. What we found too is a number of these students were getting dropped not because they owed us $8,000. In some cases they owed us $300, $400. So in 2011 we started a program that's called Panther Retention Grants. The students have to do nothing. They don't have to apply, they don't have to self-identify. We look at the data at students who are close to graduating, who are getting dropped from our rosters, and who are good risk for graduation. As long as their balance is below $1,500, what we do now is put the money in their accounts. Just say, you're good to go for the semester. What we found is this is a very efficient use of institutional aid. Almost 87% of the students who get one of these grants, averaging $900, goes on to graduate. Last year alone, over 1,300 of the students who got bachelors from Georgia State had one of these grants at some point in their academic careers. And because it's worked so well, we've scaled it up immensely. We've given almost 16,000 of these grants out over the last 6 or 7 years. And for those interested in how we can possibly afford to do so, the Gates Foundation asked the same question. They paid Boston Consulting Group to come in, and Boston Consulting looked at 6 years of data and determined this program runs with a positive ROI. We give the students on average $900, but they contribute almost $3,000 for that semester due to their tuition and fees, from money they pay towards their bill or from loans they take out and so forth. So we're helping the students, and we're actually helping the revenue flow of the university at the same time. The third and final example I'll give is this one, 5,700. This is the number of students who are dropping out of Georgia State every academic year as recently as 2010. This is a different group than the students who we were dropping because they couldn't pay us. These are the students who are enrolled one semester and not enrolled the next. And if the president asked me why were these students dropping out, at the time I couldn't give him a good answer. So in 2012, we launched a big data project. We used 10 years of our data, over 2.5 million Georgia State grades, 140,000 student records. The point was to find in the historical data any recurring behaviors that correlated in a statistically significant way to students dropping or flunking out of Georgia State University. We postulated maybe we'll find a few dozen. We found 800. And what Georgia State has been doing now for 7.5 years is tracking every single Georgia State undergraduate for every one of these 800 risk factors every single night. As we update all our data systems, we're looking for any of these behaviors. If one of them is identified, the next morning the advisor assigned to that student gets an alert, and they have 48 hours to reach out to the student and offer some help. A lot of what we're tracking is just common sense issues. We found that every semester about 3,000 students sign up for classes that don't apply to their degree program, or they're not taking the course in the right sequence. And in the past, many of those students would be allowed to take those classes, and it would become what is commonly now referred to as wasted credit hours that don't advance the student closer to a degree. Now we're tracking every registration record, and before the first day of classes begin, getting students into the right classes. We were using predictive analytics like these. We found, it's a simple example, a strong correlation between the first grade that a student gets in his or her majors and their chances of graduating on time. So if a political science major, you look in the center of the screen, gets an A or B in their first political science course, they're graduating from Georgia State on time at a 75% clip, which is great for us. If they get a C in that first class, they're graduating on time at a 25% clip. We had never done anything with that C student in the past other than pass them on to upper level coursework where 75% of the students would begin to collect D's and F's, and then some point a year later or so, we would finally intervene. Now we intervene at the sign of that first C grade. We sit down with the student. Maybe there are reading and writing issues that the student is facing. Maybe it's just they're working 40 hours a week. But we're going to diagnose the problem now rather than when the student digs him or herself into a much deeper hole. The trick with this use of predictive analytics and advising alerts is to do it at scale. Over the last 12 months at the Atlanta campus of Georgia State alone, we've had over 60,000 one-on-one meetings between our staff and our students that were prompted by alerts coming out of this platform. We did not correct all 60,000 problems, but I can say 7 years ago, these were 60,000 issues that were going completely undiagnosed. Students were signing up for the wrong classes. They were underperforming in prerequisites. Nobody was lifting a finger. We were expecting our first generation students to have diagnostic powers that we lacked. And now we're finally taking responsibility for guiding students through the bureaucratic maze that we have created. When we launched this platform in 2012, we immediately saw significant increases in retention rates, especially for our non-traditional students, our military learners, our adult learners, our part-time students. They're finally getting tracked for 800 risk factors and getting this proactive outreach. Since we've launched in 2012, we've also seen a significant drop in average time to degree at Georgia State. We've cut about half a semester off the time it takes a Georgia State student to complete all the requirements. Not because we've diminished any requirements, we haven't, but because students are meeting the requirements much more efficiently now. And does that translate into any significant gains for the students? Well, here's the dollar amount. This graduating class from this most recent spring of 19, saved $18 million in tuition and fees compared to the graduating class the year before we launched this platform, merely because they met requirements more efficiently. And here's maybe the most surprising result of using these predictive analytics, that some of our faculty feared when we launched the platform that students would gravitate to the easiest majors and the easiest courses, because after all, we're advising them based on their probabilities of success. Well, we've now had over 500,000 interventions with students since we started this initiative, and our fastest growing majors are computer science and biology, and every year we've set new records for the number of students completing STEM majors. It's not because we've had a big increase in the number of students declaring STEM majors. What we've had is a huge decline in the number of students declaring STEM majors and then wiping out after a semester or two, as we sat passively by in the past and watched while they struggled in math and struggled in science and so forth. Now there are alerts going off as early as 3 weeks into the semester, and students who might otherwise have been failing a class, maybe they'll pull out a B and be ready to go the next semester. So in conclusion, let me talk about a couple aggregate impacts from these scaled approaches. One of them, I just heard the tail end of the last presentation talking about ROI. There's a huge ROI to doing student success well, especially in a time when college demographics are on the decline, when the number of high school graduates is not increasing, and in fact, in many states going down. Every 1% we improve our progression rates at Georgia State, it's worth about $3 million of additional tuition and fee revenues a year. We have not improved our rates by 1 point in the period that I've been discussing this afternoon. We've actually improved them by 23 percentage points. So we're talking about $60 to $70 million of additional revenues that the university is holding on to every year. That was walking away just a few years ago. Of course, I'm motivated more by this slide. My academic trade is I'm a religious ethicist. Despite all those demographic shifts I described at the very beginning of my talk, we are graduating over 3,000 more undergraduate students every year than we were less than a decade ago, a 73% increase. And when you look where the gains have come from, the biggest gains have come from the students who struggled the most under the old bureaucratic system. It's not because any one of these initiatives is targeted by race, ethnicity, or income level. It's not. All of these supports are available to all students equally. But when we began to support the students more proactively, the students who benefited the most were the students who struggled the most under the old platforms we had. And what impact has this had on our graduation rate? Well, two things. One, our graduation rates have not improved incrementally, they've improved exponentially. We've more than doubled our graduation rate for our Black students. We've almost tripled it now for our Hispanic Latino students. But the second impact is that we have eliminated equity gaps. So we've gone 5 years in a row now in which our African American, our Hispanic, and our Pell students have graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. Race, ethnicity, income level no longer predict who will be successful at Georgia State. And this institution in the shadow of the Martin Luther King district that was once segregated and that was grossly underperforming for our students of color as recently as a decade ago, now and for 6 years in a row, confers more bachelor's degrees to African American students than any other college or university in the United States. And isn't that a more fitting tribute, to this school in the Martin Luther King district? Last slide. For those who think that it only works at Georgia State and that we have some special formula that only applies in this one context, the state of Georgia challenged that assumption. 3 years ago in 2016, they consolidated us with the largest community college in Georgia. And we began rolling out incrementally the same programs I've been describing to you this afternoon. And here you can see the results. We've already tripled the IPED's 3-year graduation rate for this community college. And just 2 weeks ago in the Chronicle of Higher Education, they ranked over 800 community colleges nationally for another and perhaps more important metric. What is the success of an institution in either graduating its students or successfully transferring them to a 4-year institution? And Perimeter College is now in the top 20 institutions nationally, with 83% of the students either completing a degree or successfully transferring to a 4-year institution. So, the story of Georgia State is one of specific programs, and hopefully there's some lessons to be learned there. But the other lesson that I hope you learn is that, we've often assumed that the equity gaps that we track back to 8th grade math scores or 3rd grade reading scores are intractable. And by the time the students get to our institutions, there's little or nothing we can do. And what Georgia State shows is, if we concentrate on supporting students systematically and at scale, we can make a transformative difference and finally deliver on the promise that we have made to our students and their families. So thanks very much for your attention, and thanks for having me with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Rennick. By way of you came through loud and clear and incredibly impressive statistics. I'm hopeful that you can stay with us. We're going to shift to our next presenter, Dr. Angela Byers-Winston, and we're going to move the phone so you'll be able to better hear her presentation and then take questions as part of the panel.
Very good.
Hopefully that works for you.
I'll stay on the line.
Dr. Byers-Winston, welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to President Ray Cross and to the Regents for the invitation to be here with you today. I am delighted to be part of a duet that will be presenting, including my colleague, Dr. Juan Pablo Ruiz, who I will introduce at the conclusion of my presentation. My presentation will center on the topic of institutions potentiating talent and workforce development and the role of mentorship in that process. I will organize my comments into three parts, specifically first focusing on the changing landscape of work and workers, as Mr. Sheehy has previously described, and implications for why mentorship matters. Secondly, I will focus on mentorship as a talent and workforce development tool, summarizing empirical findings that have just been generated and reported in a new study from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, particularly for STEM fields. And thirdly, I will conclude my presentation based on recommendations from that national report and talk about what colleges and universities in Wisconsin can do to advance effective mentorship through actionable, evidence-informed practice and policy. Currently, the landscape of work itself and the workers is changing. And there are three major forces that are changing our nation's future. The first one is the changing structure of the U.S. economy. The second is the skilled worker shortage. And thirdly is the demographic shifts that are occurring in our U.S. population. The first one, relating to changes in our economic structure, are characterized by what the World Economic Forum calls the fourth industrial revolution. This term, introduced in 2015 by the executive chair of that forum, Klaus Schwab, is characterized by a range of new technologies that are fusing the physical, digital, and biological worlds. Think of advances in artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, analytics, supercomputing, self-driving cars, and digital twins. There are even new occupations that are emerging, including the physicianeer, which is a combination of an engineering-based medical degree. There are great opportunities in this fourth industrial revolution, but there are also challenges in terms of who will benefit from those opportunities. Some of the biggest challenges are being felt in the STEM fields, as previously defined: science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and I include the second M for medicine, which is related to the second shift in work and workers, the shortage of skilled workers that is most notable in the industry related to manufacturing, for example. In 2018, Deloitte released a study regarding the highlighting of the manufacturing skill gap alone that may leave, they estimate, 2.4 million positions unfilled, with implications for potential economic impact of $2.5 trillion. Which leads to the third shifting factor, changing work and workers. Needless to say, many of the people who will be part of that shortage and shortfall of skilled workers happen to come from populations historically underrepresented in the workforce, which is the third shift in these changing demographics. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data continue to show that the workforce will be increasingly comprised of individuals who are female, from underrepresented racial ethnic groups historically in the labor market, and individuals who continue to work beyond the traditional retirement age of 65. One might think that these demographic shifts create a fantastic opportunity for the diversification of the workforce. After all, if you have more diverse people in the general population, won't they naturally be absorbed into the labor market? Great question, I'm glad you asked. This is exactly the research question that my colleagues from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and I took on in 2015. We published a paper based on 5 periods of US Census data from 1970 to 2010. Using those 40 years worth of national census data, we asked the question, to what extent does the demographic shift in the overall US population become absorbed in the labor market? That is, given the growing US diverse population, do we see changes in where they work in the labor market using 35 different occupations? And we found 3 disturbing trends. First, American Indians are the least likely to experience, and the most likely, to experience huge economic and employment disadvantages, partly due to differences in educational attainment. However, when we controlled for American Indians having similar backgrounds to white individuals on factors like age and sex and educational level, marital status, even the state of residence, we tried every statistical model you can think of, they were still 31% less likely to be employed. The second disturbing trend was that black males' proportion of the labor force in 1970 was ironically greater than in 2010. They were more likely to be out of the labor force even when they didn't have a background of incarceration. And thirdly, there were small changes in gender and racial ethnic diversity, specifically in the STEM fields in the last 40 years, with engineering and computer science being particularly challenging. So our analyses reveal, using national data, that if we are not intentional about bringing diverse groups in and keeping them in the workforce, especially in STEM fields, nothing will change. It will take more than more people in the pipeline to advance talent and workforce development. More recently, in 2019, the Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce Association issued a report as part of their Future Wisconsin project evaluating the state's workforce competitiveness. They issued 6 strategies for improving the workforce pipeline and quality in Wisconsin. They include attracting and retaining talent, all the way to reaching disconnected groups, many of the themes that we've heard from other speakers this afternoon. I argue that all 6 of these strategies are dependent upon mentorship to develop the next generation of professionals in Wisconsin. We need mentors to attract and retain talent. We need mentors who will help upskill existing workers. We need mentors who will facilitate access to career pathways and promote assistantship. We need mentors who increase career awareness and reach disconnected groups. Because mentorship has become an increasingly popular topic, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine conducted a study on the science of effective mentorship, specifically in STEM fields. For those of us who may be less familiar with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or as we call it, NASEM, it was established in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln, signing that into law. And the body operates as an advisor to the nation on science. It is a nonpartisan, nonprofit set of institutions that connect understandings of science, engineering, and medicine to advising national policies and practice. I had the privilege of chairing a 2-year study through the National Academies of Science on the science of effective mentorship in STEM, and I have material here for you if you'd like to see some of the information. We were able to have a dozen scientific individuals with varying expertise from various disciplines, all the way from the social sciences to the physical and life sciences. For 2 years, we had the opportunity to delve into the literature about what does the evidence say about making effective mentorship work. I want to highlight some of the names in red besides myself so that you know Wisconsin was well represented on this report with Dr. Christine Funn, who is a scientist here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and even the study director for the National Academies of Science grew up here in Madison herself, and her parents are outstanding scientists, professors emeritus from the University of Wisconsin. We spent over 18 months collecting data nationally, holding 18 listening sessions on university campuses and professional society meetings. We commissioned 3 literature reviews of what we know about the evidence of making mentorship effective and how it works. We convened 3 public workshops across the country to gather input from scholars and practitioners, both public and private sectors, to understand what are the factors that make mentorship work. I want to first define mentorship because that was a critical contribution, I think, from this report, that we actually get clear about what we mean by mentoring, because if I queried every one of the regions, every one of us would have an individual definition of what we mean. We focus on mentorship as a professional working alliance in which individuals work together over time to support the personal and professional growth, development, and success of the relational partners through the provision of career and psychosocial support. So we emphasize in this definition that there's a relationship, so people are involved and there are important exchanges that happen that support and benefit both parties, those being mentored and those doing the mentoring, and that includes 2 critical functionings, not only the traditional kind of skill development, which we would consider a career function, that we're used to, but also the psychosocial support functions that help to create emotional support and role modeling. I'd like to highlight several of the findings from the NASM report and then highlight Wisconsin's work in these areas. A theme, I think, throughout our presentations is that we have evidence, there are factors of what we know helps to develop talent and workforce, and we are primed with Wisconsin to implement many of these practices. There are 4 key findings that I want to highlight. One is that effective mentorship is associated with positive outcomes for the students and the mentees that we're working with. Secondly, effective mentorship is a learned and developed skill. It is something that can be taught. Thirdly, cultural awareness can increase mentorship effectiveness. And fourthly, institutions have a critical role in broadening access to effective mentorship. The first finding, mentorship matters in positive outcomes for our trainees, our students, our mentees. Effective mentorship has been linked to enhanced mentee productivity, self-efficacy, or their confidence to perform a task well, career satisfaction, and it is an important predictor of academic performance and persistence itself. There are numerous studies that we found through our literature review that repeatedly document when effective mentorship is happening, students succeed. A study conducted by myself and my colleagues, Dr. Christine Fun and Dr. Branchaw, also faculty here at the UW, took a sample of undergraduate students here at the UW who come for biology summer research programs, most of them coming from underrepresented racial ethnic backgrounds themselves. And we found that their perceptions of how effective their mentoring relationships were statistically predicted their own confidence about being a future researcher and their actual persistence from an undergraduate degree into a PhD. What was important about this particular study is that most of our students happen to come from outside of Wisconsin as an undergraduate, but will come to UW for their graduate education. And so that mentoring relationship becomes the crucible through which many of them are coming to have their first contact with UW-Madison. So when it works, we get future graduates who come to the UW. Because we know that mentorship works, it's also important, I think, to highlight the amount of time that faculty invest in doing mentoring. From a national survey conducted by University of California, Los Angeles Higher Ed Research Institute, almost 80% of faculty view preparing their students for the workforce either high or highest priority. And over 33% or 34% to 44% are mentoring more than 9 undergraduates in any given academic year. But interestingly, only 7% have training to be effective mentors. So we have this tremendous investment. We know that mentoring works. We know that people are spending a lot of time engaging in mentoring activities, but have never had any formal education to do so. So we took on the second finding from this report, the fact that mentorship is a learned skill that can be taught. Mentorship education matters and it works. And Wisconsin has been the leader for the country in developing these types of curricula. And we also want to highlight that these curricula exist to train not only the mentors, but also the students for how to maximize their mentoring relationships. We have articulated standardized competencies. We've adapted them for different disciplines from astronomy to zoology, but I kept psychology up there so you know we have it for the social sciences, the earth sciences, the humanities. We have even adapted these curricula for government, departments of government, and across different career stages, mentoring undergraduates, mentoring faculty, and mentoring graduate students. We have tested them with national studies that have been published over and over again that show when we train mentors, they feel more effective as mentors across time. They actually make changes in their behaviors compared to those mentors who do not get training. And importantly, the mentees who work with trained mentors rate those relationships more positively than those students or trainees who are working with mentors who have not been trained. So not only does it increase the effectiveness that the mentor feels in being a mentor, but their students notice. It matters to them. We also know that students have unequal access to mentoring and the quality of mentoring varies by group. National data have shown over and over again that students from underrepresented racial ethnic groups report that their primary advisor is less respectful of their ideas, less supportive compared to white students. Additionally, this particular variance is exaggerated across disciplines, such that students in the biological and physical sciences report that their advisors are overwhelmingly less positive than those students who have mentors in the social sciences, humanities. So again, there is something that we can do to intervene. We can educate, we can train mentors, and we also have to address these cultural variances in terms of access to quality mentoring. The third finding highlights that need. Specific focus on cultural awareness is critical in mentoring relationships. We have found in the literature, according to this national report, that mentoring that addresses cultural diversity matters directly, as well as the psychosocial needs of diverse students, is positively correlated with their science identity in STEM fields, commitment to an actual research career, and satisfaction with the research career. We know that advancing scientific workforce diversity means that we have to build our mentors' capacity to effectively engage with diversity issues that may arise in their mentoring relationships. My colleagues and I have been awarded a $3 million grant from the National Institutes of Health, for which I'm the principal investigator, to investigate this very issue nationwide. We are currently conducting an intervention to address culturally aware mentoring that has been published initially with pilot data a few years ago that shows we have training that will effectively move the needle and build the capacity of our mentors to be more effective in being culturally responsive. We are being hired not only by different universities around the country, which I'll share with you, but even industry has come to us. ExxonMobil, Bristol Myers Squibb, just in the last 3 months have asked us for proposals to bring this training to them. It makes a difference statistically for the mentors, and we are now testing that for the trainees. What impact these kinds of these trainings have on the people who work with those students. Let me give you a little bit of voice from what the mentors who go through these trainings on culturally aware mentoring have said. One said, "I'm more sensitive to my own culture and better prepared to think and ask about how others' cultures affect their work and lives. I'm much more prepared with strategies to increase their students' self-efficacy." Another person said, "I've been an advocate for diversity in admissions committees, but now I feel empowered and hope to use evidence to change attitudes." Another person said, "It will change dramatically my role in the PhD admissions and mentoring in my lab. It will make me more aware of their viewpoint and needs to succeed." So we're actually seeing that these types of trainings not only change the mentoring practices that the faculty are using 101, but it's actually impacting the department practices and policies. They're feeling empowered to change systems, which leads to the fourth and final highlight of that report, which is really on the role of institutions, which is how I will conclude my comments. Colleges and universities can broaden access to quality mentorship and support systems, which will entail significant institutional change. They can support effective mentorship through one of these 5 particular outcomes and efforts that we have seen from the evidence will make a difference for effective mentorship of our students. Provide mentorship education. We have data, we have evidence-informed models that make a difference for mentors and the students that they're working with. We have tools now that are available, and I'll share some of them with you or show you where they are housed. We can evaluate mentorship effectiveness with validated measures that have now been collated in one place in this report that are easily accessible. We can use data, just as our colleague from Georgia State highlighted, to hold broader conversations about effective mentorship activities and innovations. And finally, we can reward and incentivize mentoring. Remember the statistic that 34 to 40% of our faculty across the country are mentoring more than 9 undergraduates every year. That should be recognized and count for something. As I mentioned, there's a growing investment and support for mentorship in peer institutions around the country. I just highlight a few. University of California, San Diego, Health Sciences now has department-level initiatives where there's a mentorship leader in every department. Vanderbilt University, their graduate school of health sciences, is now using the culturally aware mentor training that we've developed to advance the training of all of their faculty in the health sciences and connecting that to student outcomes in their actual PhD programs and to their perceptions of the climate in their training programs. Oregon Health Science University has a mentorship passport program such that there are many opportunities that faculty can use to literally get a stamp as they go through different trainings and collect more resources in terms of their effective mentorship and actually lead to certification. And Harvard University has now launched a mentorship education that's coordinated for their graduate school, launched across the entire campus. Myself and Christine Fun are facilitating all 4 of these efforts. Again, Wisconsin is in the mix. Lastly, the role of the state of Wisconsin. I want to highlight that there are evidence-based resources that exist that are ready to use today. They have been optimized across many disciplines to support the mentoring relationships across different career stages. They are warehoused literally right here at the University of Wisconsin. They are free, they are validated, they are evidence supported, and open access ready to use today. In addition to this National Academy's report that is in paper and online, we created an online guide that summarizes this material for easy access. Anybody can get to it. It has the same drop-down menus where you can access all of the evidence that I just described. My final slide, the time is right to potentiate talent and workforce development in Wisconsin through effective, evidence-informed, inclusive mentorship. Thank you. I will now introduce my colleague as part of the duet, Dr. Juan Pablo Ruiz, who recently completed his PhD in biomedical sciences at Oxford University in the United Kingdom, where he studied the environmental cues important for blood stem cell formation during development. He completed dual undergraduate majors in biomedical engineering and English from the University of Miami in 2013. Juan Pablo is trained as a peer supporter at the University of Oxford University Counseling Center, and since then has been advocating for systems and cultural changes to improve the mental health and training environments of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers. He served on the Next Generation Researchers Initiative, which our own Senator Tammy Baldwin helped to promote through the National Institutes of Health, and he's currently the president of the Future of Research, a nonprofit organization that advocates and empowers early career researchers. And I am selfishly proud that Juan Pablo is currently completing a postdoctoral position with myself and Dr. Christine Fun here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I turn it over to Dr. Ruiz.
Thank you, Dr. Byers-Winston. And thank you all for taking some time to listen to me give a brief talk. I'll be quick about some of the issues that have already been touched upon, but specifically with regards to training environments. So as Dr. Byers-Winston mentioned, our talk talks about potentiating talent and workforce development. I will be speaking briefly about training environments. And I'll start by giving you a brief biology lesson with regards to the work that I did when I was a PhD student. So as Dr. Byers-Winston mentioned, I did my PhD research in adult blood stem cell development. We were trying to figure out the ways in which we could replicate the processes that blood stem cells went through during development in order to replicate those processes in a lab so that we could treat different patients coming in with inherited bone marrow failures and disorders. This is not my work in particular, but it's my favorite paper from my PhD, and I highly recommend those of you who are biology geeks like me to go look at the YouTube video. It's a very beautiful animation. What you see there is the blood stem cell in green, right in the middle, and it's being cuddled by these endothelial cells, as the researchers termed it. And it's also being touched and signaled to by a gray stromal cell in the left there. And basically what these researchers found, as a lot of other researchers have found, is that if you don't have the very specific environmental cues that the stem cell needs to reach its full potential during development, it will not behave and act like a stem cell. It will look like a stem cell, it might behave a little bit like a stem cell, but it won't fully be a stem cell that you can use in therapies. And that's one of the reasons why researchers, including myself, have not yet been able to recreate and fully develop blood stem cells for therapies in the lab outside of the body. So the environment matters. Now, why am I telling you this story? It's because it ties into why I got so interested in the work that I'm currently doing now and why I shifted so dramatically from the work that I did in my PhD. I was in a good research environment. It was decent. I got the right mentorship, and it was very important for me. But I very closely worked adjacent to my lab. There was another lab, which was a very toxic environment. It was a very difficult environment. And one of the reasons I got trained as a peer supporter was so that I could provide support to the graduate students and the postdoctoral researchers who were in that environment, really struggling with their mental health and really struggling with their ability to go forward in their careers as scientists because of the way that the lab was mismanaged and because of the environment. And one of the things that blew my mind is that I was in a research lab in a research institute at one of the top universities in the world. And we know we have decades and decades of literature on how to manage organizations, on how to manage teams, on how to manage groups. And I was in an environment, or I was in a department that claimed to be evidence-based, right? We use evidence and we use data to create some of these simulations, and yet we were ignoring all of the data on how to best manage people, on how to best create environments that would lead to people's creativity and productivity. And I noticed this, the amount of productivity loss and creativity loss that we had from the trainees that were in this particular lab was incredible, just due to the cognitive dissonance, the anxiety, the stress they were receiving from working in this environment. I've had the privilege of working in lab environments across continents. I've worked in Tanzania, I've worked in the United Kingdom, and I've worked in the US here, and I found that this is actually, unfortunately, quite ubiquitous to academia in general. And so this got me very interested in the work that I do. Much to the chagrin of my supervisor, I became obsessed with the literature on the environments of human beings as opposed to the environments of the stem cells, which wasn't what I was doing my PhD in. One of the things that I think leads to this idea, at least in STEM fields, I think we still have a very antique or old way of thinking of support. And I think a lot of us in these fields like to think of support and rigor as completely diametrically opposed, right? If you are supporting your students, if you're providing them with support in their studies, then you're not being as rigorous as you should be. Whereas the data mostly coming from organizational psychology, but also from the fields of education, show that these are actually not diametrically opposed. They're actually, as we say in engineering, are orthogonal, but another way to think about it is they're actually not opposed. You can see these as being at a 90-degree angle. And where you get your biggest creativity and productivity is right there. That's your sweet spot. Yes, you need high support, or high rigor, high difficulty, high excellence, whatever you want to label that axis there. But you also need high support. And there's data, again, from across fields that show this is where we need to be. And yet, in environments that are training PhD students and postdoctoral researchers, as well as undergraduates, this is not where we are, and a lot of it has to do because of this idea that the two are diametrically opposed, and they're not. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the work that I've been doing in the advocacy space, which is how I got into this work in the first place. As Dr. Byers-Winston mentioned, I am the president of this organization called Future of Research. We're a nonprofit And this is our mission statement up here. We champion, engage, and empower early career scientists with evidence-based resources to improve the scientific research endeavor. So basically what we're doing is we're saying, well, we're trained as scientists, we're trained to look at the evidence, we're just going to look at the evidence about our own environments, about our own training, and about the way that we are being prepared to be scientists. This has led to quite a few successful projects. One of our first was the postdoc salary efforts that we did. You would be surprised at how many people do not know how much their postdoctoral researchers are getting paid. And in part that has to do because postdoctoral researchers are called so many different things at different universities across the nation. So we did Freedom of Information Act requests across universities in the United States, and we compiled data on what postdocs were getting paid because no one knew what they were getting paid before we did this research. We also were involved with some of the efforts of the Coalition for the Next Generation of Life Sciences, which some of you might be aware of, but it's basically a coalition of universities that is becoming much more open and transparent about publishing data on where their graduates go after they've gone through different graduate programs in their departments and at their institutions. We recently published something on Ghost Peer Review, which was around looking at the prevalence of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers who were doing peer review of scientific literature, but who were not getting credited for those reviews. It's a very common practice in STEM fields in academia, but just because it's common doesn't mean that it's right, and we sort of published the data on that as well. And as Dr. Byers-Winston mentioned, we've also been involved in the Next Generation Researchers Initiative, which came out of the 21st Century's Cures Act. We had our last executive director and our last president involved in the National Academy's report that came out, which was similar to the one that Dr. Byers-Winston was on. And I was in a working group at the NIH where I was invited by Dr. Francis Collins to participate in this working group. I'm briefly going to talk about our latest project, which was my baby, and it's the Departmental Training Climate Guidelines that we came out with. Again, talking about this environment and focusing on how we can best prepare our graduate students and our postdoctoral researchers to develop into the scientists of the next generation. So we decided to get together stakeholders from across career stages and from across universities. We did this at the Big Ten Center. We had all the way from graduate students to deans and administrators from different universities, and we came up with different guidelines across 9 domains. And the idea was that we would use this tool. We developed these 9 domains across different excellence tiers, bronze, silver, and gold. And we would use this as a tool in order to inform early career researchers, but also departments as to where they were in comparison to other programs and how they could improve their training environments to best succeed. We're currently working on a publication that we hope to publish soon, and I'll give you some of that data. It's basically a condensed version. It's 7 things that departments can do in order to improve their training environments for their PhD students and their postdoctoral researchers. And I hope some of this might be useful to the board in some of the choices and decisions and discussions that we're having today. The first thing that we came up with, very similar to what Dr. Byers-Winston recently mentioned, we think that students need supplemental, and not just students, by here I mean graduate students and postdocs, require supplemental mentoring support. This is in addition to their main supervisor, the person that's in charge of their day-to-day training activities. There was also a need for more structured peer support and peer cohorts. This particularly came from postdoctoral research scholars who mentioned that they felt the lack of support from their peers or even a community of peers because they start at all these different times as opposed to graduate students who usually start in a cohort at the same time. But to also structure different conversations and talks and workshops where they could support each other in terms of career and training. Required mentor training is something that keeps coming up a lot. As Dr. Byers-Winston showed in her last slide, a lot of people think they're doing mentoring or want to be doing mentoring, but they're not necessarily trained to be doing mentoring. One of the comments that kept coming up in our meetings is that the professors that need the most mentor training are the ones that think they're not going to get anything out of that mentor training, and so they don't attend. And so this is one of our main recommendations that came out, is that departments and institutions really should have some metric or some way of requiring their faculty who are going to train undergraduates through postdoctoral researchers to undergo some sort of mentor training. We also came up with the suggestion of exit surveys. I think it's really important and clear, and this has come up quite often, that if you don't have data on your department and your training environment, there's no way you can improve. This was something that came up quite consistently. We also decided, or not decided, but one of the other conclusions that we came to is that once you got past the sort of qualifying exam stage of your graduate studies, you did not have clear guidelines and timelines, which led to a lot of postdoctoral research scholars and a lot of graduate students staying way after they had met the requirements to graduate and therefore unable to continue on in their career. Standard and transparent salary and benefits. Again, going back to this idea, you'd be surprised as to how many graduate students and how many postdoctoral researchers, these are people who have, higher degrees in biomedical or STEM or technology, are actually living below the livable wage of their respective cities wherever they're getting trained. There was a study of postdocs that was recently published, a survey across the nation, and the results are quite staggering in terms of how many scholars and trainees are getting paid below the livable wage. And finally, career and professional development resources. I think we need to be more intentional with how we prepare our scholars, whether from the undergraduate level all the way to the postdoctoral trainee level, in terms of how they're preparing for their career. And so these are some of the summary, next steps that we came up with. As I mentioned, we're hoping to publish this paper soon. And so that's really what I wanted to hone in on, really, that the environment matters, and I think we need to be intentional, and I think we need to recognize that there is evidence from across a lot of spheres on how to promote and how to create and how to design environments that really train our undergraduates, our graduate scholars, and our postdoctoral research scholars in moving on to the next stage of their career and in really helping them reach their best potential. Otherwise, like the stem cell, they won't be able to reach their best potential. So with that, I'd like to thank you all again for your time. You can find me on Twitter there at Happy Stem Cell. My email is listed there, and the website for where we have the full set of guidelines with all of the excellence tiers is right there. It's mentoringfuturesci.net. So thank you very much again for your time and for your attention.
Well, thank you to all four of our panelists. We are going to shift, and as I mentioned previously, I'm going to turn it over to Regent Eve Hall, Dr. Eve Hall, President and CEO of the Milwaukee Urban League, to moderate some Q&A with regents and chancellors and other interested parties. I would make a bit of a housekeeping matter. We would like to spend about 25 minutes, if we could, on Q&A. I think this is important. However, we do have closed session obligations that will take some time. So with that, ask your questions quickly but directly. And I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Hunt.
Okay, so a lot of information was shared. Let me just unpack a couple of things just to frame the discussion. Tim talked about opportunity costs. He talked about the loss of taxpayer resources, and that we're now in systems of schools instead of a school system. And think about how daunting it is that we have gone from 99% to 55% in terms of enrollment in public school systems. Dr. Rennick, I thought it was pretty profound in terms of how, as educators, we look at adding programs, but he spoke to the fact that we really have to look at the core of how we operate and interact. He also reminded us that it's not too late in higher ed, that if we go about making change systemically and at scale, we can still make a difference in higher education. And then between Dr. Byers-Winston and Dr. Ruiz, the fact that mentoring really needs to have training involved. So it is really a skill. What are the implications? I think the daunting loss of individuals when we talk about from freshmen to high school. I mean, we start off at a loss before they even get to us. So think about that, and think about how it then spills over to our workforce constraints and our talent constraints. The cultural issues that deal with both recruitment and retention, not only in workforce, but when we talk about higher education. And while we speak of 2.7% in unemployment being a great thing, when we unpack it by race, we're talking 4 to 1 in terms of unemployment, even with African Americans, which then contributes to our ranking of 21, which then contributes to our challenge around economic inclusivity and vibrancy, which then contributes to the ability for students to afford to go to post-secondary. How'd you like that? That's pretty good, huh? All right. I had to get a little action in here. Come on, come on. All right, so finally, there's a lift here and there's a promise. And the promise is that we have 87 companies who've committed to change. That means that we have now increased ownership of the issue between business, education, and community. It also means that we have a sense of intentionality, because we have to be intentional if we're serious about change. We've been talking about these numbers forever. So what's wrong with that? That means we've not really reached the core of change, the intentionality and the ownership. And then finally, we are open from everything that we've heard today to learning and implementing best practices, and that the K through 16 blame game that we've been doing for a long time is now coming to an end. I'm claiming that, okay? Because we know that together we must win the end game. How is that for framing? All right, so instead of me asking questions, I think it's time for us to truly have engagement. So Regents, questions, thoughts, concerns to our panel. Yes, Regent. Yes, Regent Jones.
I think my question is for Dr. Byers-Winston. Is there any data out there that shows that mentorships on a high school level equally have positive income, even if that evidence is anecdotal? Because it seems like the earlier you'd start with the mentor-mentee relationship, the better.
Thank you, Regent Jones, for the question. The answer is yes. For the scope of our task for this report, we were charged with undergraduate and graduate career stage. You can imagine if we were to try and collate the youth mentoring literature, we'd still be in committee. And so, but the literature that I am aware of is overwhelmingly positive about the benefit and the added value of effective mentorship. I think the takeaway, whether it's K-12, whether it's K-16, or it's even in business practice, in industry, is that when we raise the level of mentorship to a professional practice where people have skills and competencies, you are more likely to do two things: make it effective, and secondly, create more access to people having equitable mentoring that looks more similar across groups. Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Hall, I just wanted to make one point of clarification. When Mr. Sheehy was talking about moving from a school system to a system of schools, and he gave those statistics, he was talking about Milwaukee public schools.
Correct, that's what I was saying. Oh, if I wasn't clear, I was speaking about Milwaukee public schools.
Okay, I wanted to make sure everyone was clear on that, not statewide.
Yeah, no, that's great clarity coming from who you are, correct, Regent? Let's be clear, yes. Other questions, comments? Yes, Regent Walsh.
I'd like to ask the gentleman from Georgia State a question, if he's still with us.
Yes. Dr.
Yes.
Rennick?
Yeah, I'm still here. You might need to translate the question from the chair position, because I can't hear the questioner.
Okay, my question involves the data analytics that you were using. It sounds like there was a lot of programming involved in that. What kind of resources did Georgia State provide you? And can you give us an idea of either cost or difficulties that you ran into? Where was the data end of this housed at Georgia State?
Okay, so Dr. Rennick, the question dealt with your data analytics, the resources needed for you to conduct the analysis, any challenges, and then where did the information lie in terms of the institution?
Okay, great question. I think the most surprising thing about our use of data is that we're using very few data that we haven't been collecting for decades. So some people assume, since we're doing all this tracking, 800 risk factors and so forth, we must be tracking students and their physical presence across campus and who's going into the dorm and eating it. None of that. Almost all of our analytics are based on the types of grades and formal records that institutions have long collected. So we're basing almost all of our analytics on the majors, the minors that students are registered for, the grades they achieve. In some cases, the early alerts are based on data coming from our learning management system. And as such, we didn't really need to put a lot of resources into data. There are a number of external companies and vendors that basically market these kind of resources. We were one of the first national partners with probably the biggest vendor in this space, a company known as the Education Advisory Board out of Washington, D.C. And we do pay them a fee every year, and it is substantial, more than $150,000 a year. But we're tracking 40+ thousand undergraduates across all our campuses, and you saw some of the results and some of the ROI that come from those results. So it's not like every campus needs to develop its own analytics expertise and cutting edge team, and it's a good thing they don't, because it's a very competitive and expensive market right now. You know, cities like Atlanta, I'm sure it's true in Wisconsin as well, there's a premium for the people who do this kind of data research, and so a lot of the work is done by companies that we subscribe to.
Thank you. Did that answer? Yes. Okay. President Cross.
I just wanted to answer that. The system acquired that same product and is fitting it for each of the campuses are fitting that now to their campus. Some, I think Milwaukee's been using it for 3 years. Eau Claire has been using it for a while. La Crosse has. So all of the campuses will be developed. A lot of that's a cultural change too.
Great. My expectations just went like this.
Other questions, comments? Yes, Regent Torrey.
Mr. Sheehy, Dr. Byers-Winston, and Dr. Ruiz, thank you very much for your presentation. Speaking from one non-traditional identity, so recently UW-Madison has implemented a PAVE program, which stands for Peer Advising for Veteran Education. It's only in its second year. I'm currently serving as an advisor, a mentor, but it's certainly more than was offered when I was coming on campus in fall of 2015. So we do I sort of see it as a proof of concept that could be utilized for all other identity groups, not just veterans or military connected students, but and that includes transfers and other non-traditional students. But so we do have this bridge on campus. How would you envision a campus to industry mechanism within the purview of what you've been discussing and presenting to us? And that could be, addressing things like saturation rate of mentors to mentees, how long an individual would be connected to their mentor formally.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think there's a lot of literature on mentorship maps and mentorship networks, and I think it's important to recognize that, as you mentioned, there is, particularly when underrepresented minorities or non-traditional identities are concerned, that you have a potential oversaturation of a need for mentors and the overwhelming need for mentees. And I think, Dr. Byers-Winston can speak better to this in terms of the findings of the study. But the idea that if you have multiple mentors engaging with one particular group or with one particular person, then you can sort of spread that out a little bit. And I would argue from the industry perspective, there is a really, really large untapped pool of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers who are waiting on those tenure track appointments to become open. And the reality that we know is that they're not there, right? Only 15% of students who come out with their graduate degree, either a PhD or then later go on to their postdoc, will become tenure track faculty. And so I think industry is missing out on a key opportunity in tapping postdocs and graduate students from the time that they're doing their training and reaching out to universities and engaging in these types of mentorship relationships so that the postdocs and the grad students, if and when they feel stressed by what comes next and there's no job opportunity available for me, realize that there's actually a large market out there that just hasn't made that connection yet. So yes, making that connection is crucial.
Thank you again, Regent. I can't see your last name from here. I don't have my glasses. I apologize.
Tiedemann.
Tiedemann?
You can call me Tori.
Regent Tiedemann, thank you so much for your comment and especially for raising the matter of the returning student population or first-time student population who come from with a veteran background. So thank you for your service as well. The other piece I think is important that came out of the report for institutions and industry is anything that's intentionally recognized tends to be valued. Right? Mm-hmm. And so what we value in terms of recognizing the potentiating nature of institutions to support the talent development of the folk who come to us. And that's why we put that in our title, potentiating agents, institutions as potentiating agents. And so recognizing the value of multiple mentors, we actually laid out in visual form from the literature based on the evidence, 6 different models of mentoring. Physically what that looks like, recognizing the intentional need to support success beyond the academic intellectual abilities. That's not why people are leaving higher ed. And again, we've shown that I think from Chancellor Blank said, they're not leaving because they can't cut the mustard academically. It's the environment that becomes the divining rod, so to speak, about how folk get facilitated through their successful transfer point. So I think the other piece from the literature is acknowledging that there are multiple ways to help people be successful through different mentoring maps, which has to do with the ways that people have clusters of networks of mentors around them. So you don't have to ask, well, you're going to work with Professor Byers-Winston for 16 months, but maybe you work with Mr. Sheehy for 4 months. You don't even have to worry about that because you have multiple networks that people can access experience, talent, tactical knowledge from.
Yes, Regent.
The only thing I'd add to that is I think there's just listening to the presentation today, a great opportunity and learning experience for the private sector, which does some of this, but I'm not sure it does it in a pattern that you're laying out. And again, the ability to upskill and retain talent is critical in a talent shortage environment. And so I think companies are looking for ways to do this, and I think there's a lot to learn in terms of how to do it more effectively.
Mm-hmm. And certainly, I mean, the alumni referral method is, I mean, invaluable in this context, but just within industry, even not between, I mean, individuals with different alma maters, so that would also, I think, be a valuable mechanism.
Yeah, and in terms of the veteran piece, there's a really interesting, successful program in Milwaukee between Manpower and Rockwell. Mm-hmm. And they're working directly with veterans as they come out, transition out of their service. They've got a really good process for onboarding these folks. They come in, I think it's a 10 or 12-week course. Rockwell pays them, houses them, and when they come out, I think like 95% of them have a job with a skill set that they built with Rockwell, and they're actually training folks to go work for their customers, so little enlightened self-interest, so Rockwell can sell more of their equipment to those customers, and the problem is they don't have people to operate that equipment. So it's a really interesting program if you're interested in looking into it.
Thank you. And again, it'd be something to consider as a proof of concept that all identity and background groups would be able to utilize.
Regent Menendez, did I see you?
Sure, thank you. Statement to make before I ask my question. So I believe in mentoring. I've been mentored since the time I was able to make mistakes, so basically my entire life. But as to my academic and professional careers, without those mentors, I wouldn't be sitting here. So you're right, absolutely, and everybody knows that. The question I have is this. I believe, Dr. Byers-Winston, you said that this campus stores information about mentoring and how to go about it, or some guidelines. Is there a way that is publicized for people that there's somewhere to help them? Because some people really mean well and try to mentor, but the opposite happens. And so, You know, we've all had those too. So is it publicized? And if not, how can that be accomplished? And thank you for your work.
And thank you, Regent Manatees, for that comment. I think I would welcome the Regent's instructions about how to make that happen. Because these data and these resources have existed since 2005. They were part of the initiative of Dr. Joe Handelsman, who's the current director of the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. And so it's been published in the journal Science since 2006. So the report, I believe, now will provide a higher visibility to what's available. I think your points are well taken, which is folk don't know what they don't know. And we have well-intended people, and our goal, as Regent Hall said, is to make them intentional. There's a difference between being a well-intended mentor and being an intentional mentor, and our goal is to upskill, again, the level of mentorship to a professional practice that's evidence-informed and competency-based.
Yes, Regent Klein.
Yes, this is a question for Dr. Rennick. I don't know, you might have to translate, Dr. Hall. The question I have is, if I understood the slides correctly, the intervention started sort of the summer after they were admitted prior to entering. Students were in a kind of a high-touch program. The question I have is, we struggle in this state with high school seniors who graduate admitted to our schools that lack readiness in English and math. Are there any best practices from Georgia State where there's been intervention at the high school level to try to ensure readiness as folks enter school?
So the question, Dr. Rennick, has to do with any interventions that you have at Georgia State in terms of math and
English
and
at the high
English,
school
math
level.
and English, that basically, helps prior to students entering your university.
Yeah, that's another great question. We've given considerable thought to these matters. The data do show that students who can complete English composition and math in their first year of post-secondary studies are multiple times more likely to graduate. And so it is a task to get students through those classes. We've done a number of initiatives. I think the largest scaled one is we've changed the way we deliver all freshman year math at Georgia State. We don't offer any lecture hall classes of math any longer. We only use hybrid sections. We've built out labs where students meet 3 hours a week with their instructors and their classmates in a computer lab working on adaptive learning exercises. So, one of the things we found is that the math-phobic students were the ones least likely to participate in the class. And, the labs kind of force the students to actually be doing math 3 hours a week. Every hour they're in one of these labs, they're getting about 80 bits of personalized, individual, and immediate feedback. So they finish exercises and the computer programs immediately give them response and cues and so forth. We've even worked with Stanford. A lot of the mentoring discussion this afternoon has been about what is commonly called mindset issues. And we've worked with Stanford on some open courseware they developed for introduction to statistics classes that have the students prompted by the computer in an adaptive way, but actually looks to the mindset issues. So a lot of the students who don't do well in math don't do well because they don't believe they can do math. And so this program is set up to give encouragement at just the right points. If a student gets 2 or 3 questions wrong in a row, it will immediately go to an easier question so that the student can see that they still can do this material and so forth. So that's been a major change. It admittedly is not a change that we do prior to the students arriving at Georgia State. This is something that we launch with the students once they're admitted as freshmen. We do have a summer bridge program where we're working with some of our at-risk student populations, some of the underserved students, to get them hitting the ground running. It's a 4-credit program, not a remedial program. So students are doing credit courses, oftentimes in English composition, before the rest of the freshman class arrives. That's been highly impactful as well. We've been able to improve retention rates for those students by better than 10 percentage points by helping them get a head start before the rest of the freshman class arrives.
Great, thank you. So this is to the panel. A question for you to us. Did I miss Who are you pointing to, Tim?
Oh, I thought you had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jan. Regent Jan Mueller.
Thank you, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you so much. A question to any of you. Regent Blank talked about the changing public views of higher education and the perception that the value of higher education is declining. And I'm concerned, after hearing this discussion, that there's probably, at least here in Wisconsin, some negativity surrounding ways to address the achievement and opportunity gap. Some negativity because of how do we overcome this when we have high incarceration rates and we've had an opioid epidemic and we're very segregated in Milwaukee. So that's all the negative, but we've heard so many positive stories about classroom training changing just now and positive mentorships at every level. So it's just a question. How can we market and get away from the negativity that's associated with depressing achievement opportunity gaps? Is that clear?
So you're basically saying in the midst of all the challenges, how can we still positively market?
And how can we better
Post-secondary
share
education?
these stories that we've heard today, that there are really a lot of opportunities out there to change?
Which really aligns with what I was going to say is, what are one or two things that the system, what can we do immediately to close the achievement gap? What are your thoughts as a panel?
And thank you, that's what I was trying to say.
You know, I don't want to simplify this because it's a complex problem, but we have so many issues outside the classroom. I'm just going to talk from Milwaukee. There's so many issues outside the classroom that impact the kids in the classroom. But like everything else, what we celebrate gets done. And so I think the celebration of these kids, the opportunity that's in front of them, and making the changes. I think about one thing, there was just a study I saw that came out about, diverse teachers having higher expectations for their students. And so there are all sorts of little threads that tie to this, but putting these kids and surrounding them, mentoring them, there's a lot of mentorship programs in Milwaukee, but giving these young kids the opportunity and the belief that they can go further than their family has or their parents have. I mean, I think that's it. There's a great pathway forward. I'm really excited about what I heard, and President Cross, your description of this data-focused effort on all the campuses to make sure that the kids that are getting there stick and stay, especially first generation. We see that. I see a lot of work being done in the high schools where they're following the kids further. They're realizing that their responsibility is not just getting them through, but getting them into and sticking with them in college, whether it's a 2-year or 4-year. I see a lot more of that going on. And so I think there's just a deep recognition at a time when we need it. If we don't turn this around, there's no way Wisconsin, or in our case, Milwaukee, is going to come anywhere close to achieving its potential when we leave so many people on the sideline that need access to these 2-year and 4-year institutions, which I think are not less important in today's environment. They're more important.
Thank you. Dr. Byers-Winston or Dr. Ruiz, please chime in.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's a difficult question. I'll answer to the board what I said to Dr. Francis Collins and the advisory committee to the director at the National Institutes of Health a few years ago, and that is to listen to us, right? And by us, I mean whatever group it is that you're trying to recruit or increase or try to get to. I think there's a lot of feeling of disenfranchisement. Whether you're talking about graduate students or postdocs who see the policies that the National Institutes of Health are putting forth as being largely related to compliance rather than actually leading to change. And I think for a lot of us, whether again you're talking about children or whether you're in the education system or whether you're talking about postdoctoral researchers, I think it's important to ask us and involve us in what it is that we need and what it is that we want, right? I think a lot of times things get lost in the slush of, maybe leadership isn't really involving us in the decision-making process. I mean, we have a very close example here at UW-Madison, for those of you who have been paying attention to the news recently. And I don't think it's specific to here. I think it's sort of this widespread thing that we have in this nation currently going on, where we feel as if the policies, the education, the leadership, and the things that they're putting forth are disenfranchised, or like there's a disenfranchisement and a disconnect between the realities of our day-to-day lives as Latinx, as queer, as disabled, or even as, just people who are, going through and trying to get a high school education. So I think community outreach and public gaining back that trust is important, and I think you don't gain back that trust unless we're not involved in the decision-making process, and I think that's incredibly important.
I would simply add, and this is the scientist in me, to be willing to experiment with evidence-informed practice. And what I mean by that is my experience, I've been on the faculty here 23 years, is that when we talk about diversifying and advancing inclusion and equity, we give ourselves a very short time frame in which to do those things. If we have a one-and-done approach, we tried it one time, that didn't work, and so we throw things away. What we've seen, and again, I commend the board for entertaining these presentations today, because what you see is that there are opportunities for us to use the best of what we know and try to experiment in a scientific way. If we didn't continue to try and come up with discoveries of drugs to prevent or cure polio, it wouldn't have happened. Most scientific experiments fail. But when it comes to diversity and inclusion and equity and closing gaps, we don't take that same approach. We act as if we have one idea, it didn't work, and then we say, we're done with it, we tried everything. And there's this defeatist mentality. And so I say, let's bring our best minds with using the best knowledge of what we have to try some very innovative experiments with cross-sector collaborations between industry and higher education. We've seen this with Google, for example, that partnered with Howard University and now Hispanic serving institutions to create Howard West, where you can go now to Google campus for a year paid for it to get the best new technology in computer science. Facebook has also partnered with universities. Amazon has partnered with North Virginia Community College to give them the best platforms in data analytics. We can experiment and figure out what works. And so I would say bring our best scientific mind to these large, critical issues. They are complex. The data that Mr. Sheehy has shown, the data that Mr. Rennick has shown, that Chancellor Blank showed, shows a growth curve over time. And we need to give ourselves time, but use our scientific minds to have evidence-informed experiments. Thank you.
Well, I am going to wrap this up and turn it back over to our chair and our president. But I would just task us as regents to use this as our launching pad to another level of thinking. Because what today represented was true collaboration, conversation between business and K through 16. And the only way, as I say, that we will win the end game will be intentionality, collaboration, and a consistent conversation and openness to do things differently. So with that, I thank you. Let's give our panel another round.
Thank you, Regent Hall, and certainly thank you, panelists. I'm going to defer and let President Cross wrap this session, but let me take the point of privilege to say this was one of our more, I think, thoughtful and deliberate conversations we've had as a board in some time, and we've been increasing this more often. But when you think about the challenges that we face as a state and as an educational system, that collaboration is what's going to improve and lift all boats. And I think many of us talk about, as Milwaukee goes, the state goes. But it's not just Milwaukee, but you've been very pivotal in this leadership, which we all recognize. And I think there are opportunities for us as a system to accelerate that. So thank you. President Cross.
I'm going to struggle with this, but I'm going to try to make it as crisp as I can. So first of all, I want to thank Tim and Angela and Juan for doing this. Why did we do this? What's the intent? I think all of us understand the problem. Perhaps we aren't aware of the details or the scope of the problem, but this is significant. I can assure you every chancellor, every provost sitting over there is dealing with this every day. How do we do this well? We've tried a number of things, and at this point you heard Becky talk about it, and Jan mentioned it, the devaluing of higher education, when you also heard Tim say, as I have known for years, as our society and economy gets more complex, the need for education is greater. Just absolutely the irony, the paradox of a society that's losing its value of higher education at a time when it's never needed it more. I find that just unbelievable. When you complicate that with how that's reflected in our political arena, and you say, well, wait a minute, it's got to be deeper than that. It's not. That's the frustrating part. The demographic challenges that we've all talked about, the nuances within those demographics is the growing elements within our economy, within our population, are brown and black, right here in Wisconsin, right under our nose. And they're not participating in our economy nearly at the level they should be. And the university is the vehicle to help them do that. And I think, golly, how could we do this better? And so what we attempted to do today, and I want to deal with Eve's comment. I'm not going to summarize this, but I want to deal with Eve's comment. This is a launching pad. Tim used a phrase that I really like, and it's haunted me most of my career. When it comes to this issue, we have a compliance mentality rather than an understanding. We've got to change our culture. It's at the fundamental foundation of this whole effort. How do we do this differently and really mean it, not just check the boxes? That's what's confronting us right now as a society, and Wisconsin's future is dependent on how the university deals with that. And I wish I could have all the chancellors come up here and talk about the challenges they face, but I am going to, Eve talked a little bit about, okay, what are we going to do going forward? What are the specific things we're doing going forward? And let me try to articulate Tim and Angela and Juan's point. At the very heart of this is the identification of who needs help and when, and finding out as quickly as possible. That's particularly important for the students. That's why we've invested so heavily in these predictive analytic tools, EAB's tools. In fact, Tim has been here and spoken about that before and helped us. The second part of that, that's the more costly part and the more difficult, is the support structure to make that happen. And I appreciated Juan's metaphor, his illustration about the stem cell and how all of that is I can't use the coddling, I think you used, or cuddling. That process is so important. It's increasingly important for those students that are struggling. It's the support structure. So once you have the data that says this student's in trouble or this student needs help quickly, what does that support structure look like? Now, here's the dilemma we face, and as it relates to faculty and staff and supporting them with mentoring strategies. How do we create a mentorship program to attract, retain, and sustain faculty of color? Because that influences the student side of this as well. So that's an important piece of this, and we want to embark on that program. Nani and I have already been talking about that. How do we do that? How do we leverage this? My point is, for years, we've done different things, we've invested in things, and the dial doesn't move. So politicians react to that and say, why are we spending any money on that? It doesn't work. To Angela's point, don't stop trying something. This is evidence-based work, both what Tim is doing and what Angela is doing. We know this works. Let's invest in this. So a part of our budgetary effort will be to ask for more money for support systems to help students, through advisors, counselors, support structures that use this data effectively to retain students, and to do the same to attract, retain faculty with mentorship programs. Those are two pieces that we're seeking as support structures for students. And the response is going to be from the public. You hear it all the time. Gee, look at that. Faculty numbers are flat or declining. Administrative numbers are going up. Those administrative numbers are non-teaching positions, and that's exactly what we need to improve the retention of our students in this state and to effectively do this. And when you look at the neighboring states, whether it's Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, or Iowa or Minnesota, if you look at those, they're struggling with the same problem. This is our opportunity, Tim, to make a difference. How the university deals with this and how our educational system deals with this, we have too many people sitting on the sideline of this economy, and this is our mantra at this point. How do we do this? To Jan's point earlier, how do we market and explain to the politicians and others that this money is important to invest for this purpose? I wish I knew. I need your help to help sell this because our future depends on it. It is what will differentiate us from our competitors nearby. It is exactly what will do it. And these are evidence-based approaches, and that's why we put it in front of you today. So I'm sorry that I'm emotional about this, because I've been fighting this my whole career, and I'm just this little white ball-head guy. I don't know jack squat about a lot of this, and I can't identify with a lot of problems that you guys have faced. But I can see it, and my career's about ended, and I feel like I've done nothing to improve this. I really have. It's our chance, and so I'm making an impassioned plea that we make a difference, and this is something that's important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Cross, and thanks again, panel. Very, very helpful. With that, I will now ask all board members to stay in place while we complete the roll call, and then we will move into closed session. We'll move right next door to my left, Varsity Hall 1. At this time, Regent Greavy, will you read the motion to move into closed session?
I move that the Board of Regents move into closed session to consider strategies for crime detection and prevention as permitted under Section 1985 1D of the Wisconsin statutes, and to confer with legal counsel regarding potential litigation in which it is likely to become involved regarding contracts as permitted by Section 1985 1G of the Wisconsin statutes.
Second?
Regent Peterson?